Hey everybody, this is chapter 3 of Neil C. Fernandez's Capitalism and Class Struggle in the USSR. This chapter is titled The Soviet Bureaucratic Capitalism, a New Theory. In this chapter, we give expanded Marxist definitions of the basic underlying categories of capitalism, and then show how they continue to exist in the USSR. In doing so, we develop an original understanding of the capitalist nature of Soviet society, and more generally, we provide a framework for understanding capitalist formations, wherein the function performed in bourgeois countries, mainly by the market, is performed in a way that is qualitatively more bureaucratic. We begin with the discussion of the nature of the USSR by stating clearly what it definitely was not, since it is an obvious fact, then, that private appropriation and exploitative production were not replaced with a society based on collective happiness and goodwill, Babuffin Buonarroti's Bonheur Commun. See Rose, 1978, chapters 13 to 15, where the, quote, free development of each, end quote, was the condition for the, quote, free development of all, end quote, Marx and Engels, Communist Manifesto. It is self-evident that Soviet social relations were never communist. It is further clear, however, that the fact that the social relations were not communist does not automatically imply the country was capitalist. Thus, according to Marxist theory, and indeed to the general principles of logic, there is nothing to prevent the theoretical possibility that a society might exist, which is neither capitalist nor, quote, pre-capitalist nor communist. Such a society might arise from a development somehow, quote, parallel, end quote, to capitalism, from the, quote, common ruin of the contending classes, end quote, of capitalism, or perhaps from an unforeseen and unforeseeable technological revolution. Footnote. In the manifesto, the quoted phrase is applied only to pre-capitalist societies, but there is nothing that removes the theoretical possibility of the quoted phrase's relevance at some time to capitalism too. And footnote. It should not be assumed at the outset that modern forms of exploitation, differing substantially from, quote, classical, end quote, laissez-faire forms, and indeed from what has replaced those forms in their heartlands, must necessarily be capitalist themselves. In this connection, it is useful to recall a few facts about the character of Russian conditions of production prior to the First World War. In particular, we would underline two main points. The first is that even at that time, the conditions were not those of, quote, classical, bourgeois free market capitalism. Thus, a crucial role in the economy was played by the state, both in providing demand, primarily in heavy industry, and in supporting the credit system. Foreign investment was massive, directly in stock shares, including bank shares, and in government and municipal bonds. Meanwhile, even as the urban economy was skewed towards large-scale heavy industry, substantial numbers of industrial workers belonged to artelli, either supporting families who remained in the villages or keeping their own plots to work on in the summer. According to Wikipedia, an artel was any of several types of cooperative associations and later corporate enterprises in the Tsardom of Russia, the Russian Empire, and the Soviet Union. They began centuries ago but were especially prevalent from the time of the emancipation of the Russian serfs 1861 through the 1950s. In the later Soviet period, 1960 to 1980s, the term was mostly phased out with the complete monopolization of the Soviet economy by the state. Artels were semi-formal associations for craft, artisan, and light industry enterprises. Often artel members worked far from home and lived as a commune. Payment for a completed job was distributed according to verbal agreements, quite often in equal shares. Often artels were for seasonal industry, fishing, hunting, harvesting of crops, logging and gathering of wild plants, berries, and mushrooms were prime examples of activities that were in many cases seasonal, although not invariably. In the 1918 article on Russian education and social structures, as of the late period of the Russian Empire, just before the Soviet Union took shape, Manya Gordon described the artel as follows, quote, "The artel association is another term for the collective ownership and operation of industry, is one of the oldest and most widespread institutions in Russia. The most ancient of these is the famous fishing artel of the Cossacks of the Ural. This association had a membership of 15,000 to 20,000 men whose work was carried on under conditions of absolute equality. The fishing waters as well as the necessary equipment were owned in common. The proceeds were divided equally among the members without regard to special skill or any other considerations. The association as a whole was divided up into groups or minor artels of perhaps a score of workers. Each group had its, quote, elder, who supervised the work and looked after the accounts. The various branches had complete freedom of action, though they shared expenditures and profits. The organization of the artel was much simpler than that of the mere village collective. There were no written agreements. Slacking was dealt with by admonition, and in chronic cases by expulsion from the artel. No admission fees were required. All that was required was the capacity and willingness to work. A rather disjointed organization, one would say. On the contrary, it was almost militaristic in the unquestioning obedience rendered to the elder, who was elected annually. Apart from the duties he owed to the artel, every member was a free agent. I have described the most powerful of the artels, but this scheme of association was by no means restricted to the fishing industry. As a rule, small groups of men engaged in active labor organized themselves into an artel. Although the various artels prefer the communal modes of living, their general characteristics vary. Some associations, unlike the one I have described, do not own their equipment. In that case, by general agreement, the wealthier members of the artel, who supply the necessary implements, receive extra recompense for their property. Again, there is the artel which is hired by an employer or a person who supplies the capital. The artel members share their earnings in common." End quote. In the later portion of the era of artels, some formalized types of artels emerged, with internal hierarchy and legal agreements. By the 1960s, Soviet reality had mostly killed the original spirit of the artel institution, such that in Yuri Krotkov's 1967 memoir, the term artel is defined for English language readers in a footnote as, quote, "a small workshop, ostensibly cooperative but actually under government control," end quote. In present-day Russia, there is no legally defined business term, quote, artel, as a type of association. However, some companies use the word, quote, artel in their name, especially in areas traditionally handled by artels. So that's what an artel is. Back to the text. Meanwhile, even as the urban economy was skewed towards large-scale heavy industry, substantial numbers of the industrial workers belonged to arteli, either supporting families who remained in the villages or keeping their own plots to work on in the summer. In the countryside itself, subsistence production was widespread, and most peasants remained in communes. For an excellent account of the Russian economy in the post-emancipation period, see Millward and Saul, 1977. But the second point is that behind these specifically Russian conditions, we can identify a list of more fundamental features which in world history are quite familiar. Thus, industry was organized on the basis of wage labor and profitable growth. Banking was advanced, and the countryside was increasingly subject to monetary relations. In short, it is not at all controversial to state that the predominant mode of production was precisely capitalism. And people would dispute that. Regarding what happened after the First World War, there's thus a choice of two theses. The first is that of the, quote, abolition of capitalism, end quote, that states that the peculiarity of Russian conditions, including, of course, political conditions, and of external conditions affecting Russia, caused the previously prevalent non-classical capitalism to be abolished in such a way that capitalism itself was abolished. Since this does not involve proletarian communist revolution, we should thus have to explain why it was that capitalism was abolished in a way that is totally different from the ways that had been envisaged and discussed up to that time. The second, alternative thesis is that of the, quote, non-classical development, end quote, of capitalism in a country where, in a certain fashion at least, some of the existing capitalist forms are already non-classical. It is this thesis which we will endeavor to support below. Although we do not now have to argue that industrialization continued on the basis of a wholly new society, even if the most evident changes it brought about, virtually everyone having a job and watching television, along with many of its principal products, nuclear power, computers, cars, weapons of mass destruction, are also apparent in, say, the United States, we still need to argue in a theoretical fashion. The problem now becomes that of discovering whether or not we can demonstrate the viability of this thesis without becoming tied up in too many theoretical knots. Before we undertake this task, we need to understand, though, exactly what kind of assertion is made when a country is adjudged to be capitalist. For the Marxists, then, to call the USSR a capitalist country is to make a statement about the relationship between a set of real social production relations on one hand and Marxist theory of capitalism on the other. Such a statement clearly says something about both the former and the latter. It implies many things. First, it means that the interests of the exploited inside and outside the USSR/CIS are fundamentally identical. Higher wages, unity in struggle, and ultimately the revolutionary destruction of existing society. Second, Marxist theory of capitalism becomes of theoretical use for those who wish to undertake a radical critique of Soviet society. And third, since Marx knew nothing of the USSR, its critique by today's communists must involve certain interpretations of Marxist theory that were not made explicit by Marx himself. Indeed, the critique of the USSR as a capitalist formation, just like the critique of industrial monopolies and arms production, post-war nationalization and the, quote, welfare state, end quote, and the late century privatization and the, quote, information revolution, end quote, should be expected not simply to draw upon the overall Marxist critique of capitalism, but rather to enhance it. Thus, the fact that Marx's capital cannot be applied lock, stock, and barrel to the USSR does not invalidate the, quote, capitalist, end quote, theory of the USSR right from the start. In his preface to the first volume, Marx writes that, quote, what I have to examine in this work is the capitalist mode of production. Sorry, I got spaced out for a second. Thus, the fact that Marx's capital cannot be applied lock, stock, and barrel to the USSR does not invalidate the, quote, capitalist, end quote, theory of the USSR right from the start. In his preface to the first volume, Marx writes that, quote, what I have to examine in this work is the capitalist mode of production, and the relations of production and forms of intercourse that correspond to the capitalist mode of production. Until now, their locus classicus has been England. This is the reason why England is used as the main illustration of the theoretical developments I make, end quote. Marx, Capital. Marx's use of the phrase, quote, until now, end quote, should be noted. What Marx conceived himself as doing in writing Capital was not to write a book for all time, but to construct a theory of capital in general as seen through the lens of what were then, in 1867, its forms in the most advanced country, that of, quote, classical, end quote, capitalism. And, you can debate this, of course. especially with people talk about like the ideal average, capital being about like the ideal average, not like a specific empirical inquiry into capitalism at a particular period of time, but a theoretical development of the necessary features of a capitalist mode of production. But let's proceed. And the important words, the average, but also ideal average, which would be distinct from, say, empirical average. How that actually fits into like what was just said by Fernandez is another question. If, more than a century later, we are looking for a definition of what to include under the heading of capitalism, we should therefore be looking for relations which do not necessarily appear in, quote, classical, end quote, forms, but also in, quote, non-classical, end quote, forms. The theory of Soviet capitalism thus clears the first hurdle. It is not absurd. It would be quite wrong to infer that the major differences between the USSR and the bourgeois countries allow us to assume without proof the non-capitalist nature of the former. Footnote. Our approach will be seen to be in clear contrast with that adopted by Tickton, who writes that, quote, in the case of the USSR, however, use value is all important, end quote. And footnote. At the same time, it is equally wrong to go too far in the opposite direction and to reduce or abstractify Marx's definition of capitalist relations to such a degree that categories with which the description of capital begins, namely the commodity and money, quote, are not just critically relativized, specific, and completed, but abolished, end quote. This is what Wilt does, and even if Wilt is right, to view capital as a, quote, disjointed movement of the self-exploitation, bracket, or self-expansion, end bracket, of value, for which commodities and money are mere forms, end quote, he is wrong to rule the commodity and money out of his definition entirely. And that's the whole like thing of like value form analysis, right? If you're familiar with that whole trajectory, right? That's their whole thing is like, I would say that's one of the core insights of it is that value, money is the necessary form of appearance of value. Value is not something that can exist, socially exist in distinction, in separation from money. Like money is a necessary feature of a general a valorizing society, I guess. As we shall argue below, if capital is, as Wilt says, necessarily, quote, disjointed, then one must be able to identify two theoretically and practically distinct categories in it, namely those which Marx labels C and M. Otherwise, the concept of, quote, disjointedness, end quote, has no meaning. And once the underlying categorical analysis of Marx's capital is ignored as too, quote, specific, end quote, the concept of, quote, capital, end quote, itself becomes at best purely mystical and at worst superfluous. New section, defining capitalism. Our starting point is thus the same as Buick and Crump's, namely, the consideration of what capitalism essentially is. The definition of capitalism, which we shall begin with, has three main elements, and it is convenient to deal with them here in the following order: the commodity, hence exchange value; wage labor, hence the proletariat; and generalized production for profit on the basis of generalized exchange, hence profitable growth. We then deal at length with the further underlying categories of value, abstract labor, and the value or capital form of the commodity and money. Footnote. The best introduction to the underlying categories of capitalism are to be found in parts 1 to 2 of Volume 1 of Marx's Capital. Also useful are Rubin, 1928, Kay, 1975 and 1979, and Cleaver, 1979. I'm not sure if the K, I'm pretty sure that's in reference to, Isaac Illich Rubin, Jeffrey Kay, and Harry Cleaver. I think Kay's work might be in the book, on Value, by, what the hell's her name? Diane Elson. End footnote. New section. Commodities, wage, labor, and production for profit. Commodities are goods which are bought and sold. On the one hand, commodities are useful things which satisfy human needs and hence have a utility or use value. On the other, since they are exchanged, they must also have a value in exchange or an exchange value. At this level, commodities are only useful to their possessor insofar as commodities can be exchanged for something else. In themselves, commodities are quite useless. Or in Marx's words, quote, the exchange relation of commodities is characterized precisely by its abstraction from their use values, end quote. Since commodities have only existed for a tiny fraction of human existence, it is necessary to stress which lies behind purchase and sale. First, there must be an absence of concrete community, of communism, where everything would belong to everybody. In its place, there is private property, a state corresponding to the process of private appropriation. A state corresponding to the process of private appropriation, where constituent parts of the world's wealth are appropriated in such a way as to deprive or impoverish those excluded from such appropriation. Footnote. In French, the dependence of private property upon deprivation is linguistically self-evident, the adjective privé, private, being a past form of the word priver, to deprive someone of something. End footnote. Second, if things are appropriated privately, end footnote. Second, if things are appropriated privately, then by the very fact of appropriation, things' utility must have been, quote, mediated through labor, end quote. This does not mean that they are necessarily movable and solid, quote, objects, end quote. Still less does it mean that they must be manufactured. Indeed, pure oxygen or space on the beach, once privately appropriated and made saleable, are just as much commodities as tables or telescopes. But if something's utility has not been so, quote, mediated, end quote, as is the case with unenclosed virgin soil, for example, then it cannot be made into private property. The, quote, essence of private property, end quote, can only be labor, described by Marx as a, quote, expression of human activity with inalienation, end quote. In short, by dint of being private property, commodities must necessarily be the products of labor. Third, the categories of purchase and sale are but aspects of the single category of exchange. This implies the existence of economy, definable as the organization and social production of scarcity. Human relations are mediated not only by the interrelation of objects, but also more generally by the very exchangeability and socially reproduced scarcity, themselves human relations which underlie the exchange process. But however, quote, mystical, end quote, the character of the commodity may be, as Marx puts it, in Capital, no understanding will yet be able to provide us with an adequate definition of capitalism. This is because commodities, while commodities are necessary for the existence of capitalism, are not sufficient for the existence of capitalism, as is best shown by the fact that commodities existed many centuries before capitalism was born. Indeed, there is nothing in the definition of commodity exchange which does not apply equally to goods which are bartered, or to those exchanged by merchants enriching themselves merely by buying cheap and selling dear. Capitalism is more than this, and was established only when commodity logic became generalized, and in becoming generalized made a major historical step forward by taking over production. And in becoming generalized, capitalism is more than this, and was established only when commodity logic became generalized. In becoming generalized, made a major historical step forward by taking over production. There are two main aspects of this change. First, human productive power itself becomes a commodity. There is thus the expansion of a class of men and women who own no productive assets apart from their creative capacity, namely their ability to work, or, quote, labor power, end quote. In the case of the expropriated peasants or dispossessed artisans, the productive resources they once had are taken away from them. In the case of freed slaves and serfs, what was formerly the direct utility, from their own viewpoint, of a portion of their labor time is removed. Those with any of these pass are consequently forced to sell their capacity to work, demand permitting, in order to be able to buy back the conditions of survival. The ability to create, produce, and enjoy productive adventure is alienated, crushed into an abstract common denominator by being sold in return for a wage packet. In Marx's words, the worker's, quote, life activity is for him only a means to enable him to exist. He works in order to live. The worker does not even reckon labor as part of the worker's life. Labor is rather a sacrifice of the worker's life, ... The product of this activity is not the object of his activity. End quote. Marx, 1847. Qualitative dispossession or poverty, corresponding to the separation between enjoyment of the environment and the environment's productive transformation, becomes absolute once productive activity takes the form of wage labor. Qualitative dispossession or poverty, corresponding to the separation between the enjoyment of the environment and the environment's productive transformation, becomes absolute once productive activity takes the form of wage labor. The adoption by human labor of such a form, as Marx makes clear, is absolutely crucial to capitalism. In his words, quote, capital presupposes wage labor presupposes capital. They reciprocally condition the existence of each other. They reciprocally bring forth each other, end quote. Marx. The second aspect which characterizes the emergence of capitalism and distinguishes capitalism from previous societies is the generalized establishment of production on the basis of an intention to sell. Since this involves the generalization of exchange, and therefore of competition, it also implies the generalization of production for profit. This is not so simply by reason of greed of those who control the means of production, but also on pain of their losing out to competitors. Thus, the accumulation of exchange value becomes the motive of production in a generalized way. This means not only that there must necessarily be profitable growth, and indeed capitalism without profit-based material accumulation would be like fire without burning, but also, more generally, that there must be a constant and profitable technical development of the forces of production. In the course of this, capital moves from merely subordinating the labor process to transforming the labor process and the labor process's actual conditions. Bearing in mind that wage labor is the exchange of labor power for the wage, we're now able to compress the above into a, quote, nutshell, end quote, definition of capitalism. This is as follows. Capitalism is a mode of production which does not simply allow exchange and growth, but which is founded upon exchange as a general form of growth and growth as an underlying drive. New section, Value, Abstract Labor and Capitalist Money. It is necessary now to explain the significance of generalized exchange and necessary growth for the determination of the main categories of capitalism. New section, value. In the first place, the development of production dominated by exchange and by the drive for the accumulation of exchange value means that the production of each commodity tends to influence and to be affected by the production of virtually all other commodities. As exchange relations become generalized, exchange-dominated interconnectedness grows, and since labor power itself is a commodity, a corresponding increase must also occur in the social division of labor. As a result, workers become increasingly connected with each other through their labor, even if they themselves do not determine the conditions of their interconnectedness as free and conscious agents. Human interconnectedness is determined instead by the exchange of products. It is in order to explain the implications of this that Marx is led to base his entire theory of capitalism upon a rigorous understanding of that which all commodities have in common and of which their various exchange values are merely expressions. Namely, that which is defined as value. That which is defined as value. Marx was not, of course, the first to identify human labor as being the single universal component of all commodities, and hence the substance of value, nor was Marx the first to insist on socialized labor as the only possible basis on which exchange value can become generalized. One moment, please. Footnote. Nor indeed was Marx the first, even after the birth of the industrial era, to express a revolutionary communist opposition to commodities, money, and wage labor. On the ideas of the conspiracy for equality in Paris in 1796, for example, see Buonarroti, 1828, and the documents collected therewith, and Rose, 1978, especially pages 185 to 204. Back to the text, end footnote. But Marx was the first to concentrate theoretically on the qualitative aspect of value, and thereby to criticize the basis of generalized exchange in such a way as to inform a root and branch theoretical critique of both wage labor and the capitalist forms of the commodity of money. Whereas Ricardo proposes an, quote, embodied labor, end quote, theory of value, wherein the value of a commodity is explained as being proportional to the specific quantity of labor exchanged in its production. Marx thus emphasizes the overall social importance of the generalization of exchange relations, including the relation of wage labor, since these relations cannot be assumed to be a, quote, natural, end quote, feature of, quote, advanced human society, of the advanced socialization of production. There is a need to explain the social categories that underlie not just their existence, these relations' existence, but precisely these relations' generalization and these relations' domination of production. These are the fundamental targets of Marxian, quote, labor theory of value, end quote. This, then, is the level of the fundamental significance of the category of abstract labor. For a useful commentary, see Rubin, 1928. In short, the interconnectedness of capitalist society is determined by the exchange and exchangeability of products. The exchange values of products express their values, and the category of value is dependent upon the form of labor, which is socialized and, quote, equalized, exclusively through the generalized exchange of its products. In terms of Marx's famous quote, by equating, for example, the coat as a thing of value to the linen, we equate the labor embedded in the coat with the labor embedded in the linen. Now, it is true that the tailoring which makes the coat is concrete labor of a different sort from the weaving which makes the linen. But the act of equating tailoring with weaving reduces the former, in fact, to what is really equal in the two kinds of labor, to the characteristic they have in common of being human labor. This is a roundabout way of saying that weaving, too, insofar as weaving weaves value, has nothing to distinguish weaving from tailoring, and consequently is abstract human labor. It is only the expression of equivalence between different sorts of commodities which brings to view the specific character of value-creating labor. By actually reducing the different kinds of labor embedded in the different kinds of commodity to their common quality of being human labor in general. End quote. Marx. Capital. Thus, labor is indeed social, but rather than being social directly, labor is social only indirectly or abstractly or reifiedly. Production is not controlled by the associated producers. Workers work together, and what the workers working together produce is socially determined, but the terrain on which the workers are brought together and made to work, rather than being determined by their own needs, is determined by the requirement on the part of the controllers of capital to ensure the expanded production of exchange value in an environment of generalized exchange. Labor which is thus alienated can be defined as taking the form of, quote, abstract, end quote, labor, and the commodity which embodies a portion of such labor correspondingly takes the form not just of exchange value, but also, more generally, of value. Abstract labor and value are no more than the forms taken by wage labor and exchange value when exchanges become generalized. An understanding of the nature of capitalist commodities and capitalist production thus depends on an understanding of the inseparable relationship between the categories of abstract labor and value, and hence, as long as we bear in mind that the labor we are discussing is wage labor, abstract labor, we might equally well describe the critique as being focused around a value theory of labor. As Rubin puts it, value, quote, is not a property of things, but a social form acquired by things due to the fact that people enter into determined production relations with each other through things, end quote. Rubin. Such a brief summary has the merit of emphasizing the essentially qualitative nature of our method by pointing up the nature of abstract labor as labor which produces value. There now arises the quantitative question: how much value is produced? More to the point, what does, quote, how much value, end quote, actually mean? Given that we know that only a single component is present in all commodities, namely labor, this reduces to the question, what does, quote, how much labor, end quote, what does, quote, how much labor, end quote, actually mean? We might, of course, seek to answer this question by formulating a definition according to which an hour of skilled labor counts for more than an hour of unskilled labor, the labor of a watchmaker for more than the hour of an office cleaner. This is undoubtedly how things actually seem from the point of view of the individual controllers of capital. Regardless of the form taken by the capital under their control, a project, an enterprise, a shareholding, a nationalized firm, or whatever. But in fact, to take this road is to take our eye off the ball, for the category of value depends on the generalization of exchange and on the category of abstract labor in the abstract. And neither of these two categories appear to be of any weight at all in any answer based on the idea that some types of labor are, quote, intrinsically, end quote, more valuable than others. We can only conclude that the question of, quote, how much value, end quote, should be answered in terms which are much more simple, and we thus arrive at the view that the quantity of value can only be determined by the total numbers of hours worked, regardless of the specific type and characteristics of the labor expended. No sooner have we reached this point, however, than objections immediately present themselves. What if a worker twiddles his thumbs all afternoon? Surely we do not mean to suggest that hours spent like this can actually contribute to the value of the product. Indeed, we do not, and we must therefore introduce the qualification that the labor time referred to is in fact the the average labor time. Clearly, what is, quote, average in this sense is determined by the class struggle, not only within the workplace, but also in the wider society. But for the moment, since we are endeavoring to consider capitalist production as a, quote, objective, end quote, system, this does not stand in the way of the development of the critique. Another objection rests on the fact that technological change can and does bring about circumstances where the amount of commodities of a given type produced by a given amount of labor time increases. Of course, the new technology is itself a product of abstract labor, and therefore injects its own value into the product, but the point of the objection is that the labor time necessary for the production of a commodity is liable to change. If one firm employs new technology and another employs old technology, our critique would thus seem to lead us to the conclusion that two commodities could have identical exchange values and use values, but nonetheless contain different quantities of value. This is not, however, the case. As the individual controller of capital would be likely to agree, what really happens is that the value of the commodity still being produced with the old technology decreases. Thus, although the value of the product does not cease to be determined by the average quantity of labor time, we must make the clarification that what we are referring to is the quantity of labor time which is necessary. We must make the clarification that what we are referring to is the quantity of labor time which is necessary. Since the context is precisely that of socialized production and socialized labor in their capitalist forms, we can further define the labor time as that which is, quote, socially necessary, end quote, from the point of view of capital. Thus, what happens in the plants using the old technology is that the quantity of socially necessary time worked, considered per individual commodity, falls, and of course the means of social, quote, necessitation, end quote, and once again we exclude considerations of class struggle, is the same as the means of, quote, averaging, end quote, namely, the generalization of exchange. In the second place, generalized exchange can only dominate production if value is able to take a form which is abstracted from specific products, namely, on the one hand from specific exchange values, including those of specific forces of production, and on the other, from use value in general. To understand why this is so, it is useful to try to imagine a system based on generalized exchange where money was unknown, that is, a system of generalized barter. Clearly, in such a system, quote, a mass of swaps would be necessary before one obtained the desired article in exchange, end quote. Someone wanting a swimsuit, for example, might first find themselves constrained to exchange a table for a sack of potatoes. The point now is that all sorts of possible reasons delay in organizing a new swap. For example, she might eventually decide to cook the potatoes and eat them, thereby destroying those potatoes' exchangeability. Since she would have known all along that she might find reason to do this, the initial act of exchange would have been determined, not simply by considerations of exchange value, but by those of use value. More generally, the strength of the ties which bonded an object's exchangeability to its use value would make the process of obtaining the quote, desired article, end quote, extremely cumbersome. And whilst one might posit exchange relations as striving to dominate the entire process of circulation, they would in actual fact find themselves restricted by cords of use value at every step of the way. In practice, such a system, which has not been actualized, would be insufficient to allow exchange to achieve full generalization. Footnote. There's two footnotes here. First footnote, which I missed. It should be remembered here that since capital is a, quote, inhuman, end quote, relation, socially necessary labor time is equally well described as labor time which is technologically necessary. That's interesting. And seems true to me. And end footnote. Next footnote, which is the footnote that I didn't miss. Marx refers to this in this context to the, quote, Philistine utopia, depicted in the Socialism of Proudhon, end quote. Marx. End footnote. We therefore see that the generalization of exchange depends upon the functional existence of a general equivalent. We therefore see that the generalization of exchange depends upon the functional existence of a general equivalent. Footnote. It will be noticed that we are not theorizing a distinction between, quote, general and, quote, universal equivalents. Thus, in our terminology, exchange becomes generalized when exchange reaches the point of being the sole form of distribution of any economic importance, and there exists, quote, a circle of exchange, a totality of the same, in constant flux over the entire surface of society, end quote, Marx. In this context, we do not see Marx's distinction between the generality of values' relative form and the universality of values' equivalent form as especially helpful. The use of the concept of the, quote, universal is perhaps not wrong per se. Money is indeed, quote, universal, insofar as it is assumed, in principle, to be exchangeable even against something that does not yet exist. But it appears to us as too, quote, philosophical, especially when it is distinguished from the concept of the, quote, general. Rather than aiding in the formulation of a critique of the underlying categories of capitalism, in such a way as to facilitate the critique of their historical movement over the past century, as expressed, for example, in the fluctuating importance of gold, the dollar, the IMF, and the ruler's need for war, the distinction would seem instead to be a hindrance, at least at this stage of the presentation. End footnote. In an earlier stage of the development of exchange, this can, of course, take the form of cattle or shells or any specially chosen material commodity, but historically the commodity owners experience a growing need for the spread of a simpler form. This form, the money form, is general insofar as the money form represents pure exchangeability. In the money form self, the money form has no use value. Footnote. What made gold and silver suitable as early general equivalents was not simply their rarity. It was also gold and silver's near absence of practical usefulness, combined with the fact that little or no use value needs to be consumed in gold and silver's maintenance, since gold and silver are not bulky, not subject to rust, and unlike mercury, neither poisonous nor liable to evaporate. Platinum and palladium share these characteristics, but appear too late on the scene and are not as globally evident. End footnote. The principle, although later we shall see it to be modified in practice, is simple. Anything can be exchanged for money, and anything else can be bought with the money acquired. Money is the form which enables commodities. Did I say end footnote? I meant to say end footnote if I didn't. The principle, although later we shall see it to be modified in practice, is simple. Anything can be exchanged for money, and anything else can be bought with the money acquired. Money is the form which enables commodities to compete with each other in a generalized way. Money mediates commodities exchange, and money functions as a special commodity of money's own type, which allows the social averaging and generalized abstraction that defines the categories of abstract labor and value in the first place. Money is, quote, the bond of all bonds, end quote, Marx. Money, quote, represents the form of social relations. Money represents, sanctions, and organizes social relations, end quote, Antonio Negri, 1979. New section, value growth. On the basis of this understanding of value and money, our next concern is to deepen our understanding of growth, and growth specifically capitalist form. We know, of course, that value is what is produced by abstract labor, and that from the viewpoint of the controllers of production, the aim of production is the production of value, or, more precisely, of additional value. But what we must now ask is how the production of new value, that is, the growth of value, actually occurs. It would appear that we are faced straight away with a major theoretical problem. Given that labor power and the means of production are themselves commodities, and must therefore have their own value, what can it actually mean to say that labor produces value? Given that labor power and the means of production are themselves commodities, and must therefore have labor power and the means of production's own value, what can it mean to say that labor produces value? Surely if labor has labor's own value, then all labor does is to inject that value into the product, alongside the value drawn from the accumulated labor embodied in the means of production. And if this is so, then is the creation of new value not simply impossible? Another way to make this point is to argue that since value is determined by average socially necessary labor time, then the value of, say, 40 hours of concrete labor can only properly be defined as being, on average, 40 hours of abstract labor time. We would appear to be left with a near tautology. This line of reasoning is unsound, however, insofar as this line of reasoning is based on an inadequate definition of concepts. Thus, the controllers of capital do in fact purchase the workers' labor. What the controllers of capital do is exploit the workers' labor, which is quite a different matter. Indeed, since it only exists as a process of exertion or, quote, expenditure, end quote, the workers never actually possess their labor and are therefore in no position to sell it in the first place. In terms of bourgeois economics, it is not a stock but a flow. A crucial distinction must therefore be made between labor and the ability to labor, where the ability to labor, where labor, not the ability to labor, where labor is the expenditure of the ability to labor. Where labor is the expenditure of the ability to labor. Closer examination shows that it is the latter which is bought and sold, rather than labor itself, which is rather the use which the controllers of capital derive from what they have bought, and the value of this ability, of labor power, is far less problematic. As Marx puts it, quote, as Marx puts it, it, quote, is determined, as in the case of every other commodity, by the labor time necessary for the production and consequently also the reproduction of this specific article, end quote, Marx. Thus we arrive at the categories of necessary labor time, or the socially average portion of the working day, which is spent producing the goods consumed by proletarians, bought with wages, and which in being consumed reproduce the workers' labor power, and, on the other hand, the remaining portion of labor time, or surplus labor time, which the environment of capitalist domination forces proletarians to give to the controllers of capital for free. Since we are not comparing these periods for each individual worker, but rather assuming a context of generalized social averaging by means of exchange, we see that the surplus produced in the hours of unpaid labor must itself take a value form. And since this value does not replenish existing value, either in the form of the abilities of the producers or in the form of the material means of production, it can only be the newly created value whose production we are endeavoring to explain, as the form of surplus determined by generalized exchange, in the sense that includes the exchange of labor power for the wage. The category of surplus value brings us close to an understanding of the very essence of capitalism. There is, however, one remaining gap in our understanding of the growth of value. In effect, we have considered only a single, quote, moment of production, wherein new value is produced. If this new value were simply consumed by the controllers of capital, as, quote, revenue, then clearly it would cease to exist once they had consumed it. Since the controllers of capital, unlike workers, are not productive, their consumption does not help in the reproduction of labor power. Surplus value would certainly have been produced, but value would grow only fleetingly before shrinking back to its original magnitude. This type of growth is not the actual growth of a more lasting kind which capitalist competition necessitates once capitalist competition becomes generalized. To understand this latter growth in value terms, we must therefore look not at a single moment of production, but rather at the entire cycle of production and accumulation. The process by which growth becomes realized is not, then, the production of surplus value, although that is of course a necessary requirement. Rather, it is the reinvestment of surplus value. What we must now consider is how that reinvestment can come about. That reinvestment's functional prerequisites in addition to surplus value production. In relation to the underlying drive for profitable growth, a drive determined by the category of generalized exchange, but not reducible to it, we see immediately that what is indispensable is money. This is not a different category of money from the one we have considered above as a, quote, general equivalent, end quote. But the function money fulfills is no longer simply the permitting of generalized exchange. Money now has the additional function of permitting growth on that basis. In other words, money does not simply money does not simply permit the existence of the category of value. Money also permits the expansion of value from one production cycle to the next. The capitalist role of money can now be understood at a deeper level. It is not necessary merely to allow self-expanding value, which is how we define capital, to be accessible and accumulate by its controllers. It is necessary too, crucial so in terms of the underlying growth drive, to allow it to be investable. It is necessary too, crucially in terms of the underlying growth drive, to allow it to be investable. It is thus in the nature of capital, and not just of value, that it is able to appear not only in the form of commodities, but also in the form of a general equivalent, namely as money. In Volume 2 of Capital, Marx presents this point as follows, quote, as money capital, exists in a state in which capital can perform monetary functions. In the present case, the functions of general means of purchase and payment, ... But money capital does not possess this capacity because money capital is capital, but because money capital is money. On the other hand, the capital value, in the capital value's monetary state, can perform only monetary functions and no others. What makes these into functions of capital is their specific role in the movement of capital. What makes these into functions of capital is these functions' specific role in the movement of capital. Hence also the relationship between the stage Hence also the relationships between the stage in which they appear and the other stages of the capital circuit. In the present case, for instance, money is converted into commodities, that is, means of production and labor power, which in their combination constitute the natural form of productive capital. This form, therefore, already bears latently within this form, as its possibility, the result of the capitalist production process, end quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 2. Thus, those who control the extraction of the portion of the product in excess of what is bought with wages, who in fact, since the extraction of surplus value in a value form is the basis of the capitalist mode of production, also control production tout court, require the generalization of a means by which profits can first be assessed and then reinvested so as to generate more profits as efficiently as possible. They need to be able to answer such questions as these. Was our last investment profitable? How profitable? Would such and such a future investment be likely to be profitable? How profitable? If they could not answer such questions, they could hardly control capital in any viable way. Footnote. Money capital necessarily concerns the controllers of capital as subjects, as class. End footnote. Thus, the money form of capital is not simply the medium of generalized exchange. It is also the form that all value must adopt in order to expand. As a generalized form, it might be described as determining a, quote, language enforced by the armed power of the law, which facilitates the exploiter's reinvestment of surplus value according to the exploiter's own best interests. Its main locus of existence is outside of the production process, but within the social production cycle, the accumulation cycle, the growth of value. The predominance of the capitalist mode of production thus requires that not only the commodity, but also money adopt a specifically capitalist form. It is instructive at this point to recall that money, just like the commodity, existed prior to capitalism. As Marx points out in the famous, quote, introduction to his Contributions to the Critique of Political Economy, it is older even than banks and wages. But it is precisely one of those categories which, quote, despite those categories' validity, precisely because of those categories' abstractness, for all epochs are nevertheless in the specific character of this abstraction, themselves likewise a product of historic relations, and possess their full validity only for and within these relations, end quote. Marx. Footnote. A contribution to the critique of political economy. First published in 1903, this text was written in the notebooks now usually known as the Grundrisse, German for outlines, first published collectively in 1939. Generally speaking, a contribution to the critique of political economy refers to the 1859 text by Marx. I don't know what this text from the Grundrisse is that's also labeled Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, but anyway. Aware, then, that historical theoretical critique must be more than a linear tracing of specific categories through time, Marx stresses that, quote, in all forms of society there is one specific kind of production which predominates over the rest, whose relations thus assign rank and influence to the others. It is a general illumination which bathes all the other colors and modifies the other colors' particularity. It is a particular ether which determines the specific gravity of every being which has materialized within it, end quote. Marx. It follows that in formulating a theoretical critique of capitalism, it would be quite, quote, unfeasible and wrong to let the economic categories follow one another in the same sequence as that in which those economic categories were historically decisive. The economic categories' sequence is determined, rather, by their relation to one another in modern bourgeois society, which is precisely the opposite of that which seems to be their natural order, or which corresponds to historical development. End quote. And in capitalist society, the predominant, quote, kind of production, end quote, is the production and realization of additional or surplus value, or, in other words, of capital. Money is not just money, it is capitalist money. Footnote. The description of capitalist money as, quote, money, end quote, should not be overused, since in the context of the idea that capitalist money is money's, quote, achieved form, end quote, it carries more than a hint of the idea that the forms intrinsic in the capitalist mode of production are the, quote, necessary, end quote, developments of forms which existed in preceding modes. The inference can easily be drawn from the progress of capitalism. The inference can easily be drawn that the progress of capitalism was, quote, necessary, end quote, to provide the basis for the inauguration of communism. Although this is a statement we would reject, it is not possible to discuss it in the present context. End footnote. The reason for quoting these passages is to show that the theorization of money can easily reach a dead end in the wrong kind of meaning. If the wrong kind of meaning is ascribed to the fact that Marx starts Capital with a critique of the commodity and only later moves to a critique of money. After all, it is not in dispute that when money first appeared on the scene, its main function was to expedite efficient barter, nor that, even much later, it was still both a means of circulation, a medium of exchange, and a, quote, ideal, end quote, measure of value, real or imaginary gold, for example. I believe one of the findings of Debt the First 5,000 Years, or whatever the hell it was called, by David Graeber, is that the existence of generalized barter has never really existed. But also, as a side note, I don't know if he's going to talk about this later, but for a critique of the logical historical understanding of Capital, the book Capital, in the and which understands the first 3 chapters as discussing like a simple commodity production. For a critique of that like historical logical conception, which is kind of advanced by Engels, check out the piece on this channel by Chris Arthur. Anyway, back to the text. Since Marx does not begin by discussing money, and since money itself, in a certain sense, is even now a special kind of commodity, it might be argued that even in capitalist society, the commodity is more, quote, basic, end quote, than money. In other words, it might be suggested that the adoption of a value formed by money is no more than a special case of the adoption of a value formed by the commodity, and hence needs little additional explanation. It therefore needs to be emphasized especially strongly that once the theory becomes a general critique of capitalist society, money is understood to join the commodity as a second form of a more general category, the category of capital. The category of capital. Is this latter category, the category of capital, which is determinant of the entire nature of capitalist society, and capitalist society's various political economic categories. Considering the circuit of capital as a whole, Marx thus writes that, quote, all the premises of the process appear as the process's results, as premises produced by the process itself. Each moment appears as a point of departure, of transit, and of return, end quote. Marx. In short, capital is neither a form of the commodity nor a form of money. Rather, the capitalist commodity form and the capitalist money form are themselves moments of capital, of self-expanding value, and it is in this context that Marx writes in the Grundrisse of money's, quote, third attribute, end quote, which, quote, presupposes the first two and constitutes the first two's unity, end quote. It is not simply the general form of access to resources, a, quote, precondition of circulation, as well as circulation's result, end quote. Money is the, quote, direct object, aim, and product of general labor, end quote. Money is the, quote, material representation of general wealth, end quote, and indeed the, quote, general form of wealth, end quote. Marx. Footnote. In the famous missing, quote, 6th chapter on, quote, the results of the immediate process of production, end quote, Marx also states that money, which, quote, from the standpoint of exchange value, end quote, appears as, quote, real wealth, end quote, appears when invested as opposed to the, quote, possibility of wealth, i.e. labor power, end quote. Marx. Among other things, this illustrates well just how, quote, inhuman and, quote, mad capitalism and capitalism's progress actually are. First published in 1933, this text was originally written as a draft in one of the plans for Volume 1 of Capital. Since its publication in English in 1976, it has appeared as an appendix to that work. End footnote. One moment. It is at this overall and general level that the specifically capitalist function of capitalist money is best understood. Capital's drive to enlarge capital's self appears as the drive on the part of each of capital's controllers to enlarge the capital under their control. And this determines the adoption, not just by each portion of capital, but by wealth in general, of a monetary form. In particular, what must be grasped is the interaction of the categories of the capitalist commodity and capitalist money in the framework not simply of productive capital, but of the entire cyclical production relation, of which this is a necessary moment. In this context, the letter C is used to denote the category of the, quote, simple commodity, but rather, Jesus Christ. In this context, the letter C is used to denote not the category of the, quote, simple, end quote, commodity, but rather that of the productive forces as commodity. Under this heading are counted not only the material means or objective conditions of production, namely instruments of production plus raw materials, or fixed plus circulating capital, but also the subjective conditions of labor, namely purchase labor power, quote, expressing itself purposively, end quote. The capitalist commodity can thus be defined as the form of capital which necessarily embodies a concrete use value. And we stress again that this includes labor power. Correspondingly, its categorical counterpart, capitalist money, or, quote, M, can certainly be described negatively as the form of capital which has no use value at all apart from its exchangeability. But this is not yet a definition. Whilst definable classically as a means of circulation, a medium of exchange, and a measure of value, money is best defined critically in direct relation to the cycle of capital. Footnote: the idea that circulation and exchange are identical is, of course, a capitalist mystification. End footnote. It is the mediating form which capital necessarily adopts to allow capital's drive for expansion to dominate capital's investment. It is the mediating form which capital necessarily adopts to allow its drive for expansion to dominate its investment. In other words, is a necessary component of what Marx saw as the, quote, general formula for capital, end quote. Money, purchasing, commodities, money, commodity, money, prime. Sorry, I was going to try to explain that circuit, but I'll just keep it simple. Or money, commodity, more money. Explained it for me. If, as Marx puts it, quote, capital is, as we have seen, money, commodity, more money, i.e. value valorizing itself, value that gives birth to value, end quote, Marx, then money is essentially a form of capital corresponding to a function. This function involves the representation of wealth, but that is still an inadequate definition. The specific capitalist function is that of the determination of profitability and the assessment of hypothetical future profitability in a sphere outside the immediate relations of production, so as to ensure, considerations of working class struggle aside, that productive investment decisions can continue to be made in accordance with the systemic logic of value expansion, manifesting itself as the drive for profit maximization. Footnote. There's 2 footnotes. I missed one. So, Kamat's observation that, quote, surplus value can only exist if surplus value is represented is both accurate and useful. As Kamat explains, if this were not the case, surplus value, quote, would just be tied to a given process and would be of no consequence, end quote. There is also sense in Kamat's following statement that, quote, money has to be undifferentiated totality, whereas surplus value is not distinguished from value, or like money prime, or I guess like surplus money, is not distinguished from initial money. And also a differentiated totality where surplus value can present itself as different from initial value. End quote. That's the best I can explain this quote. Because it says delta K. The weakness in this sentence, however, lies in the conceptualization of money as a, quote, totality, rather than, in this context, a form, sphere, state, or stage. This allows Kamat to confuse money with the totality of capital, and eventually to arrive at the false or even meaningless view that once capital, quote, becomes autonomous and escapes, capital is nothing more than a representation, end quote. This position is quite opposed to an understanding of capital as money, commodity, money prime, and as Guerre Sociale have shown in 1977, it rests on little more than a, quote, Bowdlerization, end quote, of Marx's critique of interest and, quote, fictive capital, end quote. And footnote. Next footnote. From a working class point of view, of course, money does not appear as a form necessary for capital investment, but more simply as the form of the wage and mediating form of the impossibility of scarcity. In exchange for this sold activity, the worker gets money, ... With this money, the worker can buy commodities, things, but the worker cannot buy back his activity, ... He can sell his living activity for money, but he cannot buy his living activity for money, end quote. Perelman. Money must endure as long as capitalism. On the other hand, though, this does not mean that the quantity of money which is paid to the worker, or the quality or quantity of work which the worker does for a given wage, are not subject to contestation. But in the approach used here in relation to money, the issue of class struggle, for reasons of clarity, has been, quote, foreclosed, end quote. End footnote. It should now be clear that the aim of capitalist production cannot be defined merely as the accumulation of money by money's controllers, nor can it be defined as their accumulation of the productive forces. Rather, and more simply, is the accumulation of capital and the growth of capital's dominion over the productive forces, both material and human. It might be said that capital is capital's own aim. Our further definition of capitalism can be summarized as follows. Our fuller definition of capitalism can be summarized as follows. First, products must be commodities. Presupposing both private appropriation and exchange. In other words, products must have exchange value as well as use value. Second, labor power must also be a commodity. In other words, human production must take the form of wage labor, which implies the existence both of a dispossessed class and of those who exploit it. And third, as exchange and the drive for profitable production, that is, accumulation of exchange value, become generalized. The self-expanding exchange value, which is now expanding value, or capital, requires the generalization of a form in which it can exist apart from that of the commodity and outside of the immediate process of production. The extraction of surplus value and the accumulation of capital thus require, as both functional prerequisite and result, the existence of capitalist money. The extraction of surplus value and the accumulation of capital thus require, as both functional prerequisite and result, the existence of capitalist money. New section. Bureaucratic capitalism in the USSR. The issue now becomes, did these categories exist or were they absent in the USSR? Taking them in turn, we shall argue that they did exist and that consequently the USSR was a capitalist country. The main theoretical advance will concern the nature of capitalist money and the rejection of the confusion caused by its identification with its currency-denominated forms. New section, Bureaucratic exchange value. The question as to whether or not there were commodities in the USSR should be dealt with in relation to three areas which for analytical purposes can be set out as follows: consumption, distribution, and production. New section, consumption. Footnote. In what follows, we have found Marx's introduction to A Contribution to a Critique of Political Economy especially useful. Again, new section, consumption. Taking first the sphere of consumption, it is readily apparent that there were many goods which the vast majority of the population could only receive in exchange for rubles and kopecks. It is well known, of course, that people used various sorts of connections and information networks to find out when and where certain goods were on offer, to establish a place in the queue or to queue jump, and to arrange barter deals, but it is hardly disputable that if a worker received ruble notes in his pay packet and had to give some of them away each day in return for bread, then that bread took the form of a commodity. This would be so regardless of any effects which state subsidies may have had on bread's price or the shortage of potential substitutes on the level of demand. Similar statements can be made in relation to other goods and services, from apples and armchairs to toys and train tickets. It is equally well known that such, quote, consumer items, end quote, as domestic heating bills were considerably cheaper relative to, say, cars, than they are in a country such as the United Kingdom. But this, too, is hardly a relevant issue when we are endeavoring to focus upon the overall form of the social consumption relation. Of slightly more relevance is the fact that quite a large number of urban workers grew at least some of their food on individual allotments. Uchatsky. But even in this connection, it has to be added that in toto, this form of gardening was hardly of great political economic importance. The fact of the matter is that even when goods were on ration, proletarians either paid cash or went without. Footnote. After being enforced from 1916 to 1921, rationing was reintroduced in 1929 to 35 and 1941 to 47, and again in the late Gorbachev period, except for a short time during the economic collapse marked by the Civil War. All goods in ration have always borne a price. End footnote. Thus, it is not seriously deniable that the basic relationship was one of purchase and sale. Some, including many rich Western travelers to the USSR, may have perceived rubles as being, quote, worthless, but this was not the reality lived by the Soviet working class. The restricted availability, even to those proletarians who had saved up enough rubles, of some of the consumer goods available in advanced Western high streets is not the point. Nor are the special shops for the elite. The point is that in the overwhelming majority of cases, goods pass from retailer to consumer only on condition that rubles pass from consumer to retailer, and in no way was this condition a mere formality. New section, distribution. The second area to be considered is that of the distribution of materials and goods prior to end-user consumption, as well as the movement of materials and semi-finished goods from one productive enterprise to another, This also includes the wholesale distribution of finished goods from enterprises to warehouses. New section, producer goods. Concentrating first on the movement of producer goods, we see that the crucial point which needs to be addressed is not that prices were fixed bureaucratically, but that unlike in the retail part of the wage goods sector, they did not determine the flow of goods. Footnote. As Rutland puts it, the question, quote, how do Soviet planners arrive at prices for their industrial goods, end quote, is, quote, not as crucial as it may first appear, end quote, since, quote, few decisions are made on the basis of these prices. If the prices for a particular firm's goods are set too low, it will turn in losses. But so long as it is fulfilling its planned targets for principal products, no one will complain. End footnote. A crude comparative model would be as follows. A worker without cash would not be able to take a loaf of bread from a shop unless she stole it. But an enterprise director with the requisite combination of official seniority and unofficial influence and connections could ensure the delivery of the supplies he needed and then leave the corresponding flow of bank holdings to be adjusted accordingly with minimal fuss. Since legal considerations are not paramount, we are not especially interested here in whether the exercise of influence is legal or, quote, paralegal, or if it is, quote, paralegal, to what extent it is really determined by official rank. Of course, such a model of distribution remains rudimentary since it cannot account for phenomena such as dysfunctional inflation and the black market, which indicate that even in this area considerations of ruble price did play some sort of role, and the functioning of rubles as, quote, active money, end quote, was not altogether non-existent, but does serve as an adequate starting point for the centering of attention on the type of decision-making which predominated in this particular area of the economic system. End footnote. Footnote, not end footnote. In Chapter 5, Simis describes the role of cash bribery in industry, and in Chapter 6, Simis describes black market production. Simis points out, though, that, quote, private industry in the Soviet Union does not manufacture machinery or automobiles, ... end quote. End footnote. It is hardly controversial to note that decisions as to the actual delivery of industrial supplies, as differentiated from paper intentions, were subject to two main formative influences. The first of these was, of course, the enterprise, quote, plan. Rather than delving into the intricacies of the relations between enterprise management, industrial ministries and their glavki, departments, the dedicated planning authorities, the Politburo, and the Central Committee's economics departments, we are concerned above all to emphasize the role of the plan and the nature of the plan's formulation in terms of the overall social production relations. In this connection, the most salient point is that there was never a completely hard and fast item called the, quote, plan, according to which all enterprises obtained and supplied a range of goods in strict accordance with a set of instructions passed to them at the beginning of each period. Even if the principal summary documents of the national plan took the form of laws passed by the Supreme Soviet, in practice, quote, as soon as the process of confirming individual plans was, end bracket, completed, an extensive process of adjustment plans immediately began, end quote. Wilhelm, 1979. The various parts of each plan were then subject to a process of substantial and repeated revision. And since even current operational plans were very rarely drafted on time, for present purposes we can describe the plan revision process as effectively continuous. As a result, the details of the process of supply were not determined simply by the successive requirements of the fulfillment of long-term planned contracts. In actuality, repeated changes in formal plans, together with the consequent late communication of relevant instructions, meant that in the course of each year, the supply allocation organs had constantly to try to cope with endemic disequilibria and misallocation. This they did by issuing instructions according to pragmatic expediency. The process of supply was highly disorganized. It is known, of course, that supply plans were calculated according to underlying considerations of, quote, material balance, end quote, which stipulated that inputs were to be matched with outputs rather than specifying every last detail of each receiving enterprise's exact requirements. But even in this more general context, the constraints on information processing led the drawing up of balances to be completed for aggregate categories of goods rather than for specific products. Such a system was hardly able to erode the famous significance which gross output targets enjoyed within each enterprise, nor could it do much about the lack of an efficient system of incentives for the managers of one enterprise to be materially interested in meeting the full and detailed supply requirements of the managers of another. And so even the use of superficially sophisticated, quote, input-output, end quote, calculating techniques did not prevent the elements of, quote, planning in the distribution of industrial supplies from operating in a highly mishmash and stop-go fashion. The real role of the, quote, plan, end quote, in determining distribution decisions can be summarized as a matter, firstly, of bureaucratic bargaining during the plan revision process, that is, in effect, all the time, and secondly, of bureaucratic bargaining between enterprises and planning authorities to smooth over gaps, which is hardly even, quote, planning, end quote, with inverted commas. And in fact, as Nova bluntly concludes, the main reason that complete chaos was avoided was that, quote, most enterprises produced this year more or less the same things they did last year, end quote. Nova. The other contributory factor in the determination of supply decisions was that which operated not simply in the interstices of even the most efficiently revised formal plan, but also with little or no reference to planning authorities at all. This was the informal factor, defined by the unofficial links connecting enterprise managers both with each other and with various categories of suppliers. Usually these links were mediated by tolkachi, the much commented upon roving representatives hired by enterprise managers to procure materials, parts, and equipment wherever they could and through whatever channels were necessary. According to Wikipedia, a tolkach emerged in the Soviet Union as employees of enterprises whose role was to use informal connections to enable production managers to meet or manipulate targeted outputs imposed by the central economic plan. The tolkaches evolved in the context of the various five-year plans, helping the five-year plans to work by violating the five-year plan's core principles, i.e., as success was determined by meeting the targets, using persuasion to have targets reduced was a means of achieving success. The tolkaches were premier practitioners of blat, a contemporaneous Russian term to describe the procurement of favors. By 1937, the tolkaches had come to occupy a key position mediating between enterprises and the commissariat. Back to the text. As Berliner has described, by disposing of good connections with officials working in wholesale purchasing and allocation organs, and indeed in the supply departments of the other enterprises, tolkachi played an indispensable role in ensuring the delivery of supplies to the enterprises for which they worked. Two footnotes. Footnote 1 that I missed. Rutland observes that whereas the total number of product plans was in excess of 60,000, the number of different types of product was over 10 million. End footnote. Footnote. For an earlier reference to the role of, quote, commercial travelers, end quote, In negotiating inter-enterprise deals, see Hubbard, 1942. End footnote. End footnote. Indeed, a Gosnab Nariad supply chit appears essentially to have been a, quote, hunting license, end quote, granted to managers setting out on the search for supplies. According to Wikipedia, state supplies of the USSR, known as the Gosnab of the USSR, was active from 1948 to 1953 and 1965 to 1991. Its full name was the State Committee for Material and Technical Supply of the USSR. Its primary responsibility was the wholesale allocation of material and technical goods to state enterprises, a critical state function in the absence of markets. Gosnab was one of more than 20 state committees under the Council of Ministers, the administrative arm of the Soviet government, along with other economic organs such as Gosplan, the State Planning Committee, and Gosbank, the State Bank, created amid a series of economic reforms implemented under Premier Alexei Kosygin in the mid-1960s. Gosnab coordinated the allocation of resources not handled by Gosplan. Gosnab had mixed success in creating a wholesale trade system based on direct contracts between suppliers and users. Citation needed. The Gosnab coordinated with the USSR State Planning Committee, Gosplan, the Ministry of Finance of the USSR, and the sectoral ministries and departments of the USSR and the Union Republics. Back to the text. Indeed, a Gosnab Nariad supply chip appears essentially to have been a, quote, hunting license, end quote, granted to a manager setting out on the search for supplies. The American business theorist Weitzman has accurately likened the necessary brazenness of such, quote, pushers of an enterprise management interest to the qualities expected of successful salesmen in the West. I don't know if this is who is being referred to, but I'm assuming it is. Martin Weitzman lived from 1942 to 2019. Martin Weitzman was an economist and professor of economics at Harvard University. Martin Weitzman was among the most influential economists in the world according to research papers in economics, REPEC. Martin Weitzman's latest research was largely focused on environmental economics, specifically climate change and the economics of catastrophes. Back to the text. Others might think of the role of, quote, fix-it men, end quote, in Western public authorities, disposing of all the right connections in the relevant supply and maintenance departments, and able to ease the delivery of the required goods or a visit by the required service engineers. But analogies aside, the important role which such people played, their need of good personal connections, and their consummate skill in putting themselves forward and spotting openings are well known. The most important point to be grasped in relation to the Tolkachi is that the kind of inter-enterprise relations which they mediated were in no way, quote, accidental, end quote, to the Soviet system of industrial distribution. Such relations were, rather, an inherent part of the system, for without the, quote, lubricating, end quote, role of the Tolkach, the administrative command system would have faced insuperable difficulties in restarting production after each breakdown. Conversely, if the system had been replaced with one completely dominated by the drive for ruble profits, then Soviet suppliers would have been far less willing to hand over materials to a particular Tolkach unless that particular Tolkach could be relied upon to pay more than all the other Tolkaches who are trying to obtain the same materials. Hence, the role of the Tolkach would have been quite different from what it actually was in a system where the flow of rubles was not the main problem for either supplier or receiver. But that is not all. Once we recall that the nature of Soviet, quote, planning, end quote, was inseparable from the twin processes of plan formulation and plan revision, which are also inseparable from each other, we notice that during these processes, enterprise managers were themselves called upon to exercise bargaining skills, which were highly redolent of those exercised by the Tolkachi. The justification is thus all the greater for concluding that the distribution of producer goods in the USSR had a unified nature which was not reducible to aspects such as, quote, command and, quote, administration. This is certainly not to deny the fact that there was a hierarchy, nor that information really was aggregated by Gosplan and Gosnab, nor that those who set targets and then handed those targets down from on high did indeed possess a degree of power, nor that an important role was played by the highly efficient prioritization, qua prioritization, of heavy industry, military production, and specific, quote, showcase, end quote, projects. But what we are arguing is that the characteristics of the distribution system, rather than constituting successes of, quote, planning, are surely evidence of playing out of political economic determinations which were not themselves either planning or conducive to planning. In other words, the essence of the system was not the successful achievement of interconnected objectives set priorly and considered to represent the collective needs and desires of a social group or of everyone. The fundamental nature of the distribution system was not what was superficially apparent at the level of the distribution system's formal organizational environment. To put the same point differently, the political economic role of the plan in determining the nature of the Soviet distribution process should not be understood on its own, but only in terms of an overall form of which it was one part. The role of plan revision was another part, and the role of the Tolkach was a third part. It is necessary to understand that at bottom, this overall form was one in which the process of bargaining was intrinsic, and the primacy of bargaining among those who benefited from private appropriation clearly implies that the relations of distribution took the form of relations of exchange. New section, Consumer Goods Wholesaling. The last statement is equally applicable to the wholesale distribution of consumer goods, albeit in a slightly different way. The special characteristics of this category of distribution lie both in the role played by, quote, planning and in the other mediating forms of competition. Thus, M. Goldman has observed in regard to plan revision, quote, consumers' goods are generally not used as components in the production of other goods, ... Feedback or readjustment of all material balances is usually not necessary in the allocation of consumers' goods. If wants are greater than supply, the frequent solution is to send the available goods where the need is most critical. End quote. M. Goldman. It appears that this M. Goldman is referring to Marshall Goldman, who lived from 1930 to 2017. Marshall Goldman was an American economist and writer. Marshall Goldman was an expert on the economy of the former Soviet Union. Marshall Goldman was a professor of economics at Wellesley College and associate director of the Harvard Russian Research Center. Goldman received his PhD in Russian studies from Harvard University in 1961. Goldman was well known for his study of the career of Mikhail Gorbachev. Marshall Goldman's books on the former Soviet Union include The USSR in Crisis, The Failure of an Economic System, Lost Opportunity, What Has Made Economic Reform in Russia So Difficult, and Petrostate. Back to the text. This evidently goes some way to explaining why shortages were even more chronic in the consumer sector than elsewhere in the economy. Footnote. Goldman ignores the fact that the consumption of consumer goods is indeed productive since it reproduces labor power, but it is true that in the sphere of reproductive consumption of foodstuffs, for example, there is more flexibility in terms of substitute goods. End footnote. On the other hand, though, after the end of the 1950s, a substantial part was played in distribution by the bargaining which took place at wholesale fairs. As Skursky has shown, these fairs fell into two types. The first type was the, quote, contract fair, designed to expedite the signing of contracts by pre-deciding partners as part of the planning process. The second was the, quote, surplus goods, or, quote, purchase and sale fair, organized to help reduce unforeseen stock surpluses and deficits. This latter type functioned by allowing a high degree of competition among buyers and sellers, wherein the ruble played a, quote, active mediating role. Given that in 1953, the wholesaling system was removed from the remit of the Glavki of the various industrial ministries and placed instead under the Ministry of Trade, the holding of fairs of this second type is perhaps not especially surprising. Since the greater proportion of the cash receipts paid into Gosbank were deposited through the wholesale trade network, to a large extent there now arose an institutional as well as a functional differentiation between, on the one hand, the receipt of new monies, and on the other, the transfer of monies between accounts held by industrial enterprises. And since the role of the ruble in retailing, as mentioned above, was real rather than merely nominal, it was now fitting that the ruble's role was to some degree enhanced in what was in effect the next stage of the economic circuit. Wikipedia says the State Bank of the USSR from 1921 to 1923, State Bank of the RSFSR, and commonly referred to as Gosbank, was the central bank and main component of the single-tier banking system of the Soviet Union from 1922 to 1991. After an extended gap in 1920 to 1921, it took over the legacy of the State Bank of the Russian Empire. With the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Gosbank was terminated on the 1st of March 1992, and Gosbank's local operations were taken over by the newly formed central banks of the post-Soviet states, such as the National Bank of Kazakhstan, Central Bank of Russia, or National Bank of Ukraine, where the CBR inherited its central operations. The Gosbank was one of the three main Soviet economic authorities, the other two being Gosplan, the State Planning Committee, and Gosnab, the State Committee for Material Technical Supply. The Gosbank closely collaborated with the Soviet Ministry of Finance to prepare the national state budget. End footnote. Or not end footnote, back to the text. New section, production. We have not, however, yet reached the stage of grasping the full significance of these observations regarding resource distribution, and in order to do so, it is now necessary to consider the third area, that of social production strictly defined. Whether the Soviet economy was fundamentally a commodity economy or whether in some subtle way it fell short of being one in the full sense, we need to pay special attention to this sphere in particular in order to achieve an understanding of the whole. In Marx's words, quote, exchange is merely a moment mediating between production, with its production-determined distribution on one side and consumption on the other. But insofar as consumption itself appears as a moment of production, to that extent is exchange obviously also included as a moment within production. End quote, Marx. And, as Marx continued, quote, it is clear, firstly, that the exchange of activities and abilities, which takes place within production itself, belongs directly to production and essentially constitutes production. The same holds, secondly, for the exchange of products. Insofar as the exchange of products is the means of finishing the product and making the product fit for direct consumption. To that extent, exchange is an act comprised within production itself. Thirdly, the so-called exchange between dealers and dealers is by its very organization entirely determined by production, as well as exchange between dealers and dealers itself being a productive activity. The conclusion we reach is not that production, distribution, exchange, and consumption are identical, but that production, distribution, exchange, and consumption all form the members of a totality, distinctions within a unity, ... end quote, Marx. We should, therefore, expect Soviet production to show at least some of the same characteristics as Soviet exchange-based distribution, but at the same time, in looking at production, we shall be seeking to shed additional light on the nature of the entire political economy. The question now becomes, did the Soviet productive forces and products take a commodity form? If they did, in what way did they do so? And what were the specific implications for the nature of an economic system, which undoubtedly differed considerably from, say, one based on a drive for dollar profits? Clearly, to answer this last question fully, we shall have to discuss the overall nature of Soviet political economy, and this indeed is the subject of the present chapter as a whole. Since, however, we shall discuss the nature of labor and the nature of accumulation in other sections below, for the time being we can limit our attention to a consideration of the form of distribution of the instruments of production, and therefore, in fact, inseparably, of the form of the product which the use of those instruments gave rise to. New section, the means of production. It is worth recalling at the outset that whatever form the appropriation of the productive forces in the USSR actually took, it was most definitely privative. Thus, however fuzzy or broad or apparently tortuous the line might have been between low-level bureaucrats who were essentially wage workers and low-level bureaucrats who disposed of a small degree of de facto control over the productive forces and other people's labor, it is quite clear that the workers were exploited by a social layer or conglomeration of social layers which stood above them and disposed of the material means of production. It evidently was not the workers who decided that a processing or manufacturing plant should be built, or where, when, and to what end, or what it should process or produce, or in what quantities of what specifications, or at what speed. The material means of production were disposed of instead of those who exploited the labor of others and who were unproductive themselves. On one side, there was the relation of alienated labor. On the other, there was the control over the conditions under which that labor was expended. Equally evidently, whatever the rate might have been of workplace, quote, theft, and whatever degree of institutional rivalry prevailed among senior officials of the three main, quote, pillars of the state, the party, the army, and the KGB, the exploiters as a whole maintained considerable reserves of force to keep the material means of production under their control. The control over the means of the production was protected from the workers by force. The control over the means of production was protected from the workers by force. The consideration of the distribution of the means of production among those who did control them can now be split into two parts. First, there is the question of the form which the control over the means of production actually took, and second, there is the question of how the control was distributed and redistributed among those who possessed it. To answer the first question, we must recognize that the occupations which involved varying degrees of control over the productive forces were themselves very varied in kind. Thus, on one hand, from very soon after the coup of October 1917, the principle which governed enterprise management in the state sector, and after the nationalizations and renationalizations which put an end to the new economic policy, this included the whole of industry, was the doctrine of, quote, one-man management, end quote. Footnote. In Lenin's words, quote, unquestioning subordination to a single will is absolutely necessary for the success of processes organized on the pattern of large-scale machine industry, end quote. End footnote. According to this pivotal role in operational management was assigned to the enterprise director, whose orders had to be obeyed by everyone beneath him. On the other hand, however, he clearly could not act in whichever way he chose. Firstly, he was answerable to higher-ups in the relevant industrial ministry and its relevant department, Glavk. Secondly, through them, he was also influenced by decisions made by planning authorities. Thirdly, he was also subject, to some extent at least, to pressure from the secretary of the Partcom, Enterprise Committee of the CPSU, and the secretary of the trade union, who himself would probably be a member of the Partcom, Partkom. Where am I? And fourthly, even if the main line of command came down from the ministry, nonetheless enterprise directors were still members of the party's nomenklatura, appointed in practice by Raikom or Obkom. Footnote. In preparing this brief description of Soviet economic management, we have found the following sources invaluable: Berliner 1957, Nova 1980 and 1982, Lane 1985a, and Rutland's 1985. End footnote. And the nomenclatura were a category of people within the Soviet Union and other Eastern Bloc countries who had various key administrative positions in the bureaucracy, running all spheres of those countries' activity, government, industry, agriculture, education, etc. These positions were granted only with approval by the Communist Party of each country or region, while in Russian language the term something blah 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 has the same generic meaning as nomenclature. In the context of the politics of the Soviet Union, it refers to the, quote, party and state nomenclatura, lists of persons vetted for key management, or, quote, nomenclatura lists. Back to the text. It is equally clear that enterprise directors, ministerial officials, planning officials, obcom secretaries, and so on did not all exercise power in the same fashion. Thus, enterprise directors could handle most of the day-to-day running of the enterprises, and, crucially, they would be responsible for passing on the information required in the planning process. Ministerial officials would try to wring maximum resources out of Gosplan, while simultaneously attempting to indulge in, quote, empire building, end quote, by running their own supply organs for the enterprises under their remit. Gosplan officials would seek to set targets in accordance with strategic directives set by the Council of Ministers and the Politburo, and to police the plan revision process. Gosnab officials would try to integrate the supply of ever-short materials. Shit, I pressed the wrong button. Gosplan officials would seek to set targets in accordance with strategic directives set by the Council of Ministers and the Politburo, and to police the plan revision process. Gosnab officials would try to integrate the supply of ever-short materials, and obcom secretaries would exercise patronage in appointing the directors whom they favored the most. Footnote. That this is a highly compacted model is amply illustrated by the sort of administrative changes which occurred throughout the Soviet period. Thus, in the early years, the Supreme Council of the National Economy, the VSNKH, functioned as a kind of super-ministry, but in the late 1920s, the power of its glavki were handed to, quote, associations, end quote, based upon the state sector wholesaling syndicates, which had previously shared their function with the netmen. In the 1930s, as division and subdivision rapidly expanded the number of industrial ministries, commissariats, and the importance of the obedeni faded from the scene, the role of Gosplan as a central coordinator rapidly increased. In Gosplan, however, the autonomy previously enjoyed by, quote, former Menshevik, end quote, economists was stamped out, and indeed every official scope of operation was increasingly circumscribed by the GPU-NKVD, which sped freer in competition simultaneously. The head of Gosplan from 1938, Vozhneshensky, was arrested in 1949 and executed in 1950. Then in 1957, once the security services' reign of terror was over, a proposal was made to reestablish an economic, quote, super-ministry. Khrushchev responded to this by abolishing even the existing economic ministries, or most of them, and handing over most of their functions to newly created regional economic councils, Sovnarkozy, subordinate to Republican councils of ministers. This represented a move from division by industrial branch to division by region. Resultant autarkic tendencies were initially counterbalanced by an ascendant Gosplan. But then the latter organ itself had part of its plan implementation function removed and given to a kind of central coordination of Sovnarkozy. Eventually, in 1965, the branch ministries were reintroduced, albeit with much of their former role in organizing supplies now taken over by Gosnab. But although the proclaimed aim was an increase in autonomy for the management of each enterprise, this proved impossible to achieve in the framework of existing relations between managers, ministries, and planning authorities. relations which included, for example, the ratchet effect, the shortage economy, or, quote, seller's market, end quote, and the central setting of prices and gross output targets. Even the merging of enterprises in the 1970s into, quote, associations, or, quote, combines, behind which lay the more specific aim of increasing managers' independence from ministries, failed to remove the weight of these factors, such as the story of the development of Soviet economic management. End footnote. But if the Soviet political economy had a nature at all, then there must be some unifying characteristic running through these types of exercise of power over the productive forces, and it turns out that there was. Thus, first, bureaucrats of all types described above exercised power which amounted ultimately to power over the labor of workers. Ministerial officials tried to exercise a degree of control over supplies, for example, or Gosplan officials trying to control against considerable obstruction the objectives of enterprise directors, could only be successful in any way at all so long as the workers were alienating their labor. This does not, of course, mean that the workers are completely passive, since evidently the workers were not completely passive. But the point for the moment is that bureaucratic competition among ministerial officials, Gosplan officials, and enterprise directors was essentially a matter of the distribution and redistribution of power over the labor of the exploited and over the means of production which that labor made use of, and which indeed it produced. Second, this power can be traced back in the opposite direction too, and it became clear that the power being distributed among the various exploitative officials was that the very same power expropriated from the workers in the course of the workers' labor. A ministerial official or a member of the Politburo might have thought that they had conjured some power out of thin air by achieving a dominant position in part of the economy, or by subduing competitors within, say, Gosplan. But in reality, of course, that could not be the case, since bureaucratic infighting alone does not increase the power of the economic bureaucracy, or, in a broader sense, the state vis-a-vis the workers. The Soviet economic bureaucracy was a competitive apparatus in which exploiters fought among themselves for share in the exercise of alienated power. The third point is that it was not just accidentally competitive. Given that the workers were exploited, the only alternative forms of state economic system which might imaginably have been based upon a growth drive would have been as follows: one that was totally fragmented, with each controller, each enterprise director, say, having a precisely defined area of control, and communicating with other controllers only in cultural matters generally unconnected with the economy, one completely controlled from the top, where the supreme ruler knew everything he needed to know to formulate orders which denied everyone beneath him any scope for independence or bargaining, or finally one based on a fully cooperative collectivity among the rulers. It is certainly true that autarkic tendencies did surface in various ways at various times in the Soviet economy. An enterprise director, for example, might choose a supplier enterprise located thousands of miles away because it came under the auspices of his own ministerial higher-ups. But this is, of course, competitive behavior. Controllers and groups of controllers each possessed only a portion of alienated labor, and it was in the nature of the socialized economy that they had to relate to each other in order to retain it. Not even a ministry could achieve self-sufficiency. It is also true that there were despotic tendencies. In a number of ways, Stalin can be seen as the industrializing czar of the 20th century. But a system totally controlled from the top was always unfeasible. Like Nazism, Stalinism involved the exercise of, quote, arbitrary power over arbitrary, end quote, power by hundreds of thousands of petty dictators and inhuman, quote, men of the system, end quote, rather than the omnipotence of an all-seeing dictator. Nor was full cooperative collectivity really a likely objective for those whose entire reason for existence as a group, or set of groups, was exploitative, and who had to defend their position in the given competitive and hierarchical environment rather than spend time on searching for a wholly collective exploitative solution. Moreover, they were continuously set against each other by the difficulty of obtaining accurate information, either from the exploited or from their fellow exploiters. Competitiveness was self-reinforcing. Thus, it was in the nature of the system that it did not take any of these forms and instead was bureaucratic. In short, the interconnectedness of the economy, of the organization of scarcity, determined the necessary existence of a form of competition among those with alienated power. In short, the interconnectedness of the economy, of the organization of scarcity, determined the necessary existence of a form of competition among those who alienated power. The same statement, of course, applies equally well to the economic systems of countries ruled by the bourgeoisie, but in such countries the general rule is the prevalence of a socially and legally enforced, quote, independence-based medium for that competition, taking the form of the currency. In other words, a bourgeois with a fund of money can in principle set up shop trading whatever he likes, buy shares or indeed plant from anyone willing to sell them, and bequeath his money to anyone he especially favors. These freedoms are not, of course, absolute. And there does exist a state bureaucracy which fulfills various functions for the good of the bourgeoisie as a whole, or for a section of it. But where this does not involve direct force over the working class, it usually means either the ideological defense of the system of private property, the collective defrayment of bourgeois costs such as the reproduction of adequate numbers of workers, or the investment in a transport infrastructure, or indeed the hiving off of tax receipts, or assets bought with such receipts, to favored bourgeois groups distinct from the increasingly elusive, quote, national bourgeoisie, end quote. Not only is the state's role in the economy crucially financial, setting interest rates, levying taxes, assigning contracts, borrowing and spending to meet costs, but the overarching aim of state functioning is the amassing of capital in corporate hands in the alternating forms of means of production and financial accounts. In the USSR, however, the mediation of competition was nowhere near as fluid, currency-based as this, and for this reason the, quote, system, end quote, was founded mainly upon the importance of bureaucratic office and effective, quote, pull. But this does not mean that these foundations cease to be a form of such mediation. The functioning of the characteristic mix of maneuvering, negotiation, bargaining, and bureaucratic diktat, then, was precisely the playing out of the necessary competition among individuals who disposed of alienated power over the productive forces, either close to the ground, as did the enterprise managers, or at one remove, as did the ministerial Gosplan or Obcom officials. The fact that it was impossible to draw a line between the official, quote, first, quote, white, quote, legal economy and the unofficial, quote, second, quote, black, quote, illegal economy illustrates further how competition was the essence of the Soviet system. One second. The measure of control over which each bureaucrat disposed of over the means of production was determined by that bureaucrat's efficiency in this competition. Certainly, this competition did not operate in a market form. I'm going to say that again, that's important. Certainly, this competition did not operate in a market form, nor could bureaucrats pass on their portions of control to whom bureaucrats individually chose as their successors. Instead, control was passed on through a mixture of bureaucratic appointment and unofficial blot distribution, including via the inheritance of privilege and the, quote, education system. But bourgeois forms such as market competition and rights of inheritance are not our concern in the present context. Footnote. It is worth pointing out that Marx recognized unambiguously that capital accumulation could and sometimes did take place in a way not mediated by the market. Whilst we do not argue here that Marx anticipated later developments under Lenin and Stalin, it is interesting, nevertheless, that Marx's context, namely that of machine building, industrial raw materials, and the communications infrastructure, is not wholly unsuggestive of the massive growth of Soviet heavy industry after 1929. End footnote. We are interested in the underlying relation. The nature of a society is determined by the social production relations, not by a set of property laws, not even by those governing the details of inheritance. And since there was private appropriation, and there was also competition among bureaucrats, post holders, each of whom possessed a portion of control over the means of production, and hence over the extraction of the surplus product, then it is clear that this competition was itself neither more nor less than the system wherein portions of such privately appropriated control were exchanged. And since there was private appropriation, and there was also competition among bureaucrats, post holders, each of whom possessed a portion of control over the means of production, and hence over the extraction of the surplus product, then it is clear that this competition was itself neither more nor less than the system wherein portions of such privately appropriated control were exchanged, and anything exchanged and mediated through labor is by definition a commodity. New section, the form of the product. If the distribution of products was competitive, then the fact that the distribution of control over the means of production was also competitive should come as no surprise. But the generalized environment of exchange, which dominated Soviet production, still required further elucidation. In short, we need to consider what lay behind the use of the means of production to put out products. Why, in other words, were things produced? One property of any Soviet product was that the Soviet product had a use value. Regardless of the, quote, relative, end quote, quality of consumer goods is assessed subjectively in relation to that of non-Soviet consumer goods, all things consumed had a use value to their consumers as a matter of definition. The use value of producer goods which were, quote, productively consumed, end quote, in the production of consumer goods is similarly straightforward. In fact, even producer goods consumed in, say, the space sector also had a use value, since the people who commissioned space projects must have had, to some extent at least, a positive view of their utility to themselves. Footnote. Indeed, even goods such as stockpiled nuclear weapons do not constitute an exception. Not only did they serve a purpose in preparation for an intensification of international competition, or in the maintenance of the existing competitive balance, but even those which were hypothetically never meant to be discharged at all, would still have been either kept in good condition or left to go to ruin. In either case, we can speak of purposive consumption, albeit partial, and any product thought by its end user to have any kind of utility is a product with a use value. It does not matter that the use value is subordinated to the need or drive to compete, or to snobbery, or to the tendency of bureaucrats to build empires. The important point is that the subjectively perceived utility of the product depends at least partially upon its physical characteristics. Similarly, if an unemployed person buys a suit solely because he needs it for a job interview, it still has a use value because something that was not a suit would not be suitable. Use value subordinated to exchange value is still use value. This point is obscured by Roland for two reasons. First, in his model of capitalism, he describes exchange value as a, quote, form of mediation, end quote, of use value. But, as De Boer puts it, quote, exchange value could arise only as an agent of use value. But exchange value's victory by means of exchange value's own weapons created the conditions for exchange value's own domination. ... Exchange value is the condottiere of use value who ends up waging the war for himself, end quote, De Boer. In other words, since exchange value is necessarily abstracted from use value, its history is the history of the development of its opposition to use value. The translation here would better read, quote, ends up waging war for himself, end quote. Since exchange value is opposed to use value, is not the capitalist form of, quote, instrumentality, end quote, as opposed to, quote, autotelicity, end quote, as in Roland, 1989, for instrumentality can often be an aspect of use value. Moreover, from capitalist point of view, it is actually use value which is instrumental, and the accumulation of exchange value in its general form, that is value, which is the main aim. Roland's position that the USSR knew exchange in the absence of exchange value, and his view that, quote, material remuneration and incentives involve, quote, anthropological variant, end quote, serve to demonstrate further his insufficient grasp of the meaning of the concept of exchange. Second, it makes little sense to hypostatize in the Soviet context a specific form of, quote, mediation, defined as, quote, indicator value, end quote. Once we recall that use value is properly defined only in terms of the subjective consideration of a product's physical characteristics, we realize that, quote, indicator value, end quote, is also so definable, and hence it cannot be opposed to the category of use value in any fundamental way. If, for example, a car is produced simply so that an enterprise can put out a greater quantity of tons of steel, and let us disregard the fact that the reality would be extremely unlikely to be this stark, since in such a case it would no doubt be easiest to turn out a steel cube, then this is still a consideration of use value, and in this sense we should have to agree with Tickton, see chapter 6 below, against Roland. The point of the present chapter is to look behind such considerations in terms of the control over the productive forces. End footnote. And anything with a utility conditioned by that thing's physical characteristics is said to have a, quote, value in use, or use value. The problem with wasted use value is beside the point. The second aspect of Soviet products was that they had a, quote, value in exchange, or exchange value. To cover briefly the analysis given above, consumer goods are only valuable from the point of view of retail officials, insofar as they could exchange them for rubles. Wholesale goods were valuable to enterprise sales representatives, insofar as as the enterprise sales representatives received in return either the goodwill of planning officials or payment in rubles. Wholesale goods were valuable to enterprise purchasing executives insofar as they could enhance their blot by reducing stoppage time and ensure a greater likelihood of nominal plan fulfillment. Producer goods were valuable to Tokachi or enterprise directors or other officials insofar as by procuring those producer goods or achieving their planned allocation, they could maintain or increase their blot, and plant and accumulated means of production were valuable to those who controlled them, whether at central ministerial level or from the office of the enterprise director, insofar as official bureaucratic influence and de facto "pull" could be defended and increased. We can thus summarize by stating that there was another aspect of retail and wholesale consumer goods, goods to be processed, raw materials, and fixed investments, which was just as apparent as the utility which they possessed by dint of their physical characteristics. This lay in the fact that those who controlled them could, by ceding their control to other economic agents, enhance their own control or potential control over other products or productive forces by a different type or at a later time. And here we have a textbook definition of exchange value. All products and productive forces can therefore be said to have a dual nature, which determine their production. On the one hand, they were produced because they contained use value. On the other, and this aspect was the dominant one, they were produced for exchange. New section. Labor power in the USSR, its purchase and sale. The next issue is the question of whether or not labor took the form of wage labor. In other words, was labor power bought or was labor power expropriated from each worker in some other way? It is necessary to begin by noticing that there is a very strong appearance that workers did indeed sell their labor power. Unlike in any previous society, virtually every producer had a, quote, job, which meant that she had to work roughly the same hours every day under the supervision of others, make use of means of production controlled by others, and turn out a product for appropriation by others, in return for a wage packet containing currency notes which she could then spend on things she needed to survive, such as food and clothing. As we have seen, this meant that the worker's consumption was mediated by exchange. Unlike the slave, therefore, she was not reduced to being merely a quasi-mechanical part of the means of production, the feeding and clothing of whom was taken care of by the master. Instead, by dint of being paid wages and being allowed the freedom to shop, she was permitted a certain degree of independence. Those acquainted with Soviet reality are of course aware of the limitations on consumer choice. Given the endemic consumer shortages and the fact that things were usually snapped up as soon as they appeared, market shelves were often bare. Often products such as toys could only be bought in one place in town. The rate of saving was quite high. Moreover, tenancies were hard to obtain, even if rents and domestic heating were cheap, at least relative to the ratios between wages and prices in Western countries. And, of course, quote, connections were usually required to expedite the prompt purchasing of consumer durables such as cars. But these facts are beside the point, which is that the wage packet given to the worker in return for her labor power was real rather than purely nominal. The onus is thus very much on those who deny the prevalence of wage labor to prove their case. This, however, they have signally failed to do. Thus Tony Cliff and Hillel Tickton both advanced arguments at the core of which lies the view that wage labor was absent because there was no, quote, real, end quote, labor market. See Cliff 1955 and Tickton 1991. In this view, workers were simply assigned placements by a single employer, the state. They had to work and had to work wherever they were told to. Even when they went shopping, they received only what had been decided as appropriate for their consumption, in the appropriate amounts. Hence there was no competition for labor and therefore no unemployment. Since the ruble was essentially equivalent to company scrip, both wages and consumer prices functioned merely as a system of differential rationing. Such an analysis is faulty from the very start. As we have shown above, there was a great deal of competition among the bureaucrats and enterprise directors exercising a degree of power over the productive forces. Indeed, it is quite impossible to consider properly the nature of the Soviet system unless this is recognized for what it was. Of course, if one assumes that there was no competition and that, quote, state ownership, end quote, was, quote, monolithic, end quote, then it does indeed follow that there was no competition for labor resources, but all one has done is to develop an assumption. 1 second. I have to duplicate the page so I can get to the end notes. What end note am I looking for? I'm looking for end note 30? No, 29. 29. Where am I? 29. Footnote. Cliff goes so far as to write that, quote, in essence, the laws prevailing in the relations between the enterprises and between the laborers and the employer state would be no different if Russia were one big factory managed from the center, and if the laborers received the goods they consumed directly, in kind, end quote. A truly remarkable counterfactual avoidance of the issue. To be fair to Tickton, it is necessary to accept that, unlike Cliff, Tickton does consider the internal contradictions of Soviet economic administration. But Cliff omits, to look at the competition in any profound fashion in the context of control over labor. His theorization of production and labor in the USSR are criticized extensively in Chapter 6 below. End footnote. The non-existence of unemployment, meanwhile, would hardly show the essence of a labor market any more than the globalization of just-in-time production would show the absence of a car market. And finally, the idea that workers are literally forced to work by, quote, non-economic, end quote, means represent a stretching of the facts, since the phenomenon of voluntary unemployment was not exactly unknown. In describing above how the bureaucratic system was essentially a field in which portions of control over the productive forces were exchanged, we have concentrated on the control over the material means of production. But it is only necessary to reiterate the point that such control, or power, was derived from labor and essentially exercised over labor. To see that competition among bureaucrats must necessarily have involved competition for labor resources. And if, as seems apparent, workers really were independent of the material means of production and received their wages in return for selling their labor power, then it follows that insofar as labor was really purchased, there must have been a labor market. There is abundant evidence to show that this deduction concorded with empirical reality. As Buick and Crump have pointed out, relying upon the work of Chavance and Sapir, there was a substantial degree of worker-motivated labor turnover. See the discussion of the works of each of these scholars in Chapter 2 above. See also Lane, 1987, Chapter 3. Managers were actually led to collude with their workforces to secure bonuses in excess of centrally determined formal requirements. Rutland, in 1985, see Nova 1980 and Rutland 1985. And quite aside from the implications of competition during the plan revision process, there was a notable level of direct competition for labor among individual local enterprises. Not only did enterprises advertise for labor, they also hired many workers at employment bureau or at the proverbial factory gates. See Lane 1987 and Sapir 1984. The hoarding of labor, moreover, under conditions of microeconomic labor shortage, was a well-known feature of the economy. See, for example, Kornai 1980 and Hansen 1996. In reality, then, as Nova has noted, the, quote, forces of supply and demand, end quote, were of considerable influence on, quote, actual earnings, end quote. If earnings rose so that the enterprise directors could tempt or keep workers, then this can only mean that labor power was being bought. Finally, it might be argued that even if labor power was bought and sold, its exchange was nonetheless not, quote, general, given the prevalence of the propiska, residence permit system, and a lack
and a certain lack of congruence between official migration policy and the reality of population movement. See Helgeson, 1986. Sorry, I'm looking up Propiska. And my internet's out. But even this argument will not hold. First, there is undoubtedly an element of class struggle here. A market and labor power does not have to be absolutely, quote, free, and the general rule is that capitalist rulers try to restrict, quote, unnecessary workers' movements, both directly by imposing border controls and indirectly by encouraging parochialism and nationalism. Similarly, they have always tried to assist movements which they have considered to be in their own interests. In both areas, there is at least some opposition. Second, not only did all workers sell their labor power, but all workers were connected to each other through the generalized exchange of the products of their labor, as described above. The categories of labor power and labor power's sale were indeed, quote, general. And, third, every wage packet contained rubles, which were acceptable in every shop in the country. Since the distribution of labor power, then, just as much as the distribution of the means of production and the distribution of the products of labor, was organized on the basis of generalized exchange, we are now able to state that the mode of production in the USSR was founded upon exchange as a general form. New section. Production for profit. Finally, did the USSR know production for profit and the categories associated with it, namely money and capital accumulation? This question, it seems, is best answered after being split into three parts. First, was the determinate aim of the Soviet economic system the production of a surplus? Second, if so, was the aim, at a more fundamental level, the accumulation of a surplus, that is, growth? And third, if it was, did the surplus take the form of profit, i.e., quote, more money, end quote, or, quote, delta M, end quote? There can be little doubt that the first two questions should be answered in the affirmative, even if the emphasis is put on military production or on the various types of extensive growth which were most evident under Stalin and Khrushchev. It is clear that the aim of Soviet production was not the fulfillment of the needs of the direct producers, but rather production in excess of those needs, in fulfillment of the needs of the exploiters. More than this, it was always apparent that the underlying systemic aim was the development, both quantitative and technological, of the country's productive base. From Stalin's exhortation in 1931, "End backwardness or be crushed," to Khrushchev's speech in 1961, "Bury the United States economically," and to Begyan's avow in 1988, "Increase overall growth rates intensively," the official insistence was always on the continued expansion of the economy. I'm not going to look them up because I've looked them up a million times while I was reading Tickton. But Begyan was an economist, important economist and policy guy, advisor. I don't know exactly what his role in the regime was in the 1980s. He's still alive today. He's still writing on he's still some kind of person in Russia. I don't know if he's actually has any affiliation with the state, but he was an influential and important economist. I think he's from Azerbaijan. Anyway, perhaps the most convincing evidence that this insistence was thoroughly in keeping with the underlying political-economic reality, and therefore with the basis of the Soviet economic system, was the collapse of that system at the turn of the 1990s. Even before Gorbachev was ousted, virtually the whole of the elite, from Yeltsin to the putschist of 19th of August 1991 had been converted to the cause of market reform. Footnote. What the fuck, man? My computer is such a piece of shit. Did this shit seriously lock up? Alright, looks like we're back. What's the footnote I'm looking for? Okay, so I missed a footnote. I'm going to read that footnote first, and then there's another footnote. Footnote 1. It is necessary to add a rider here to take into account the prohibition of voluntary labor turnover which was in effect from 1940. Like the system of labor allocation overseen by Bevan in the United Kingdom from 1941, however, this did not become entrenched as the basis of the distribution of labor. In practice, it was eroded in the early 1950s and abolished in 1956, when labor turnover reached 38%. See Brown, 1966, and M. McCulley, 1969, page 47. Moreover, the fact that labor power is exchanged does not mean that it has to be exchanged on a free market, and even under a system of state direction, there is still class tension over the wage. But this argument must not be taken too far, and if the related system of labor camps had become the predominant form of expropriation of labor power or mode of production, then one would rightly speak of the prevalence of slavery rather than of wage labor. On labor camps, see for example Wheatcroft, 1981. Next footnote. In a press conference held by the putschists on the day they seized power, acting President Gennady Yanaev stated that, quote, above all, we will direct our action towards the stabilization of the economy. We will not renounce reforms intended to move us in the direction of the market. We feel, however, that there will be a need to be more precise in defining and organizing the management of our actions on a higher level, end quote. See Pravda, 20th of August, 1991. End footnote. End footnote. From a Marxist viewpoint, it is therefore self-evident, given that ideas do not determine the course of history, that the, quote, administrative command, end quote, system was proving dysfunctional in its own terms. In its own terms. The system's rulers wanted to change the system. By the end of 1990, once even the official rate of growth had fallen below zero, and once the, quote, pre-crisis situation, end quote, which followed the, quote, times of stagnation, end quote, had itself given way to a, quote, open crisis, to use the parlance of the Gorbachev period, the Soviet economic system was doomed. Having shown above that the mode of production was founded upon generalized exchange, we are now able to add that it was also founded upon an underlying drive for growth. It follows that it was capitalism. New section. Value, abstract labor, and bureaucratic capitalist money. The third question is more difficult to answer, or rather, the implications of the answer are difficult to grasp, whereas there is 1. Generalized commodity exchange of both producer and consumer goods, 2. Wage labor, and 3. The production of a surplus whose reinvestment into expanded production is crucial to the system. In other words, where there is capitalism, there must also be money. This is so because money was defined functionally as the form of capital by means of which the controllers of the extraction of the surplus product gauge their returns and reinvest them so as to generate yet more returns. In Marx's words, quote, It is impossible to abolish money itself so long as exchange value remains the social form of products, end quote. Marx. And, quote, more money, end quote, means the same as, quote, profit, end quote. Given, however, that in much of the economy, and most clearly of all in the producer goods sector, prices expressed in rubles did not fulfill what has been defined as the monetary function, identifying the form which money actually took becomes somewhat problematic. As we have shown above, the category of capitalist money can only be grasped on the basis of an understanding of the category of capital, and this itself depends on the categories of exchange value, abstract labor, and surplus value. It is therefore necessary to run briefly through these categories with respect to the USSR. Exchange value has been shown to be part of the nature of the Soviet product, insofar as those who control that product, either in the straightforward sense or in the sense of controlling productive forces, were interested in it in terms of property, which was quite distinct from and abstract from its physical characteristics. This property was nothing other than its exchangeability, by dint of which its existing controllers could give up their present control and receive in return a degree of control over other products or productive forces in due course. To recognize this is by no means to stretch a definition, but rather to pinpoint in ordinary language exactly what exchangeability means. Thus we see that for any particular bureaucrat in the USSR, it was not the physical characteristics of the products or productive forces under his control, but rather their exchange values, which were his principal concern. Since labor was socialized through the generalized exchange of privately appropriated products, including of the labor power commodity itself, it follows that the production or exchange value in the USSR was also the production of value, or, in other words, the labor power exerted was abstract labor in the fullest sense of the term. Similarly, the accumulation of exchange value by the controllers of the productive forces on the basis of the exchange-based exploitation of labor was also the accumulation of value, and another word for accumulating value is capital. The issue now arises of what the accumulation of exchange value, actually amounted to. On one hand, of course, this is straightforward. Successful bureaucrats were those who managed to extend their control over increasing portions of the overall social product. On the other, though, it is less so, since in order for exchange value to be accumulated within a system of generalized exchange, it must be able to take a form which is abstracted from the material product. And it is apparent that the only form able to play this role must necessarily have been symbolic. In short, it was whatever representation of blot or control which would be recognized by those with whom exchange took place. More simply, one might say that it was a category which unified unofficial blot with official influence or, quote, pool, end quote. Thus, if a ministerial bureaucrat, say, agreed to allow an enterprise director a certain quantity of supplies, he would actually be giving up something in addition to the actual supplies, since afterwards he would not, in general, be able to influence other enterprise directors or bureaucrats by claiming to have the power to order delivery of those same supplies. In return for this, he might hope, for example, in expectation of making it easier for the given enterprise to meet its normal targets, to increase his own influence in the ministry relative to that of his colleagues, underlings, and superiors. Footnote. Of course, the real playing out of relationships would be somewhat more complicated than this, insofar as an increase in the influence of subordinates in one office or contact network relative to others of the same rank elsewhere could well increase their boss's influence relative to the influence of bosses elsewhere, and vice versa. The fact that subordinates were often, quote, protégés should be understood precisely in such political economic terms of competition and exchange. End footnote. And as he increased his recognized influence, this real influence would increase too, insofar as his recognized influence was continually invested in the real movement of concrete material goods and resources. Above, we have stressed repeatedly that the sum total of all the bureaucrats and directors' control over the productive forces could not expand in a vacuum. It was not independent of the use of those productive forces. Rather, it was exerted over the labor of wage workers, and it derived from the expenditure of that labor. The point must now be made that the generalization of exchange and exchangeability necessarily determine the quote, generality, end quote, of a form of exchange value. In other words, the recognition of bureaucratic influence and blot, and in certain circumstances, blot was derived from the possession of large quantities of rubles, was spread over the entire country. In view of the real and social interconnectedness of labor and distribution, this recognition should not be theorized as being split up into completely discrete areas of operation. It is on the basis of this understanding of the categories of the political economy that we must now endeavor to identify in more detail the form of fulfillment of the monetary function. Since we are using Marxist categories in the consideration of a form of money which was assuredly quite different from Western or Japanese currency, and indeed not reducible in any way even to the ruble, we must now return to Marx and subtract from his theory of money those characteristics which are possessed only by, quote, classical, end quote, capitalism, so as to leave behind what it is that applies to capitalism in general. As we should expect when attention is turned to the present era, this must also involve going, quote, beyond Marx, end quote. Since, though, it is not our intention either to exegetize or to revise, we shall limit ourselves here to referring to those of Marx's thoughts on money which seem the most useful in the present context. It is fundamental, then, that money has no independent existence. Thus, in the Grundrisse, Marx discusses money as a, quote, symbol, bracket, which, end bracket, presupposes a general recognition. Money can only be a social symbol. Money expresses, indeed, nothing more than a social relation, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse. Much of what was in the Grundrisse, of course, found its way into Capital, and, as if to demonstrate that his use of such terminology was no accident, Marx goes further still in the chapter on money in Volume 1 of Capital, and makes a string of references to mysticism, quote, the name of a thing is entirely external to the thing's nature. I know nothing of a man if I merely know his name is Jacob. In the same way, every trace of the money relation disappears in the money names, pound, thaler, franc, ducat, etc. The confusion caused by attributing a hidden meaning to these Kabbalistic signs is made even greater by the fact that these money names express both the values of commodities and simultaneously allocate parts of a certain weight of metal which serves as the standard of money, end quote. Marx, Capital. If we disregard here the implicit reference to gold, which in the chapter under consideration Marx assumes to be identical with the money commodity, and attempts to unpack his reference to Kabbalah, we see that Marx is in fact drawing an implicit analogy between money and God, or what might be called the monotheistic God archetype, as it is understood by Kabbalists. His use of the concept of, quote, names, end quote, relates directly to the Kabbalah, central to which is the idea of the Sephirot, conceived as 10 aspects of God in his capacity as creator, and described as the, quote, progressive manifestation of the names of God, end quote. See Scholem, 1971. The special importance which Kabbalists ascribe to the understanding of sacred names, see Encyclopedia Judaica, pages 503 to 530, 538 and 570 to 638 Passim, thus assists us in deciphering the point of Marx's metaphor. Where am I? Just as understanding the system of names helps Kabbalists understand the nature of God, so an understanding of the system of currencies helps communist critics of existing society to understand the nature of money. But just as God is not equivalent to a list, sum, or even a system of names, nor should money be reduced to a list, agglomeration, or even a system of currencies. It is hardly a great jump from Marx's work, then, to emphasize the crucial role played in the determination of the nature of money by its access to, quote, general recognition, end quote, rather than its, quote, manifestation, end quote, in the form of a currency. Moving, it adopts forms in order to fulfill its function as one of the two states of capital. But whilst its adoption of forms is necessary, the specific characteristics of those forms, unlike those of the Sephirot, are not. When dealing with, quote, really existing, end quote, money in his own day, and we should recall that the main geographical focus of his analysis was England, Marx devotes several chapters of what became Volume 3 of Capital to the nature and role of credit. If it is impossible for those working in the autonomous school to agree with Marx that, quote, bracket, the credit system, end bracket, is the abolition of the capitalist mode of production within the capitalist mode of production itself, which presents itself prima facie as a mere point of transition to a new form of production, end quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 3. A critical understanding of credit is nonetheless found to be crucial to an understanding not just of money in general, but of, quote, really existing, end quote, money. Among the functions of credit, the equalization of the profit rate and the acceleration of circulation certainly feature very large. But what we want to emphasize here is the nature of the relevant decision-making relations. With the development of the credit system, money does not cease, of course, to be, quote, a symbol presupposing general recognition, end quote. But what does occur is the growth of an entire structure, or system, wherein controllers of the extraction of the surplus product, more specifically controllers of money and controllers of means of production, negotiate and agree upon conditions for the circulation and investment of large amounts of money. Of course, bankers only lend money when they think they are assured of a monetary return. But above all, we wish to focus on the type of bargaining involved. Bearing in mind the crude view which we are opposing, that capitalist bargaining always involves, necessarily and at every point, currency-mediated market relations, let us take the case in which such relations are perhaps as blatant as they can possibly be, namely, that of the direct placement of an investment banker onto a client company's board of directors. In such a case, it is clear that the banker participates in a very straightforward fashion in making decisions designed to maximize the debtor company's profits. But even if in this context, we would emphasize that his initial appointment to a directorship must primarily have been a way of persuading the bank to lend more money, or longer term, or at lower rates. Thus, there is still a relationship between the company and the bank such that the company tries to borrow money on as favorable terms as possible, and the bank tries to lend it according to its own independent assessment of likely risks and returns. Whilst, of course, the interests of company and bank overlap, they do not quite coincide, and it is inevitable that the company will massage information, seek goodwill, and indeed haggle on a personal level. We do not wish to deny that in this example the end aim of all the controllers of capital involved remains the amassment of value mensurable in currency terms. But it is still the case that the workings of capitalist competition make personal connections among exploiters, and the underhandedness associated with such connections appear in such a way that considerations of currency do not dominate in direct fashion every little move, communication of information, deal, and decision that is made. Faced with otherwise equivalent reports on two rival companies, a banker might well lend to someone he knows best. At this level, money, whose functions are necessarily derived from its role in the money commodity money prime cycle, The capitalist accumulation of productive forces, and more generally the accumulation of capital, is thus inextricably bound up with personal connections and, quote, weight, end quote. And since, generally speaking, the banker to whom we have been referring is most likely to be a salaried official rather than a part owner of the bank, there is a second point which is even more illuminatory. Faced with two equivalent reports, then, a banking executive can hardly fail to be influenced by the knowledge that the chairman of one of the companies under consideration is actually a friend of one of his own superiors at the bank, and might therefore be able to help his own advance up the career ladder. This will, of course, mean a higher salary, but we arrive nonetheless at the general point that really existing credit money is inevitably bound up with considerations of office, with bureaucracy. It's actually very interesting. Shit, where am I? Oh, I missed a footnote. There's a footnote, and then I missed a footnote, so I'm going to read the footnote I missed first. Footnote 33. The references are to Kabbalah, alchemy, and the Delphic Temple and the Holy Grail. In the previous chapter, referring to money as the universal equivalent, Marx has already quoted a piece from the biblical book of Revelations concerning, quote, the name of the beast, or the number of his name, end quote. That he intends such references to be useful should be clear from the view of the commodity that he expresses in the very first chapter of Capital, namely that, quote, in order to find an analogy, bracket, to the commodity form and the value relation of the products of labor within which it appears, end bracket, we must take flight into the misty realm of religion, end quote. End footnote. New footnote. Footnote 34. In a Western context, these points are even more readily apparent in connection with the state sector, but we have chosen to focus on the non-state sector in order to stress the essence of the underlying relations. End footnote. Such a recognition assists us enormously in identifying, quote, money as money, end quote, in the Soviet system, where, of course, economic bureaucracy was of considerable greater weight than it has been in the countries of, quote, classical capitalism. We have argued at length above that Soviet economic bureaucracy was essentially a system wherein portions of control over labor power, labor, the product, and the productive forces in general, portions taken in the form of permission, clout, and blot, were negotiated, exchanged, and crucially invested in production with the aim of accumulation. It was not simply a system wherein bureaucrats created posts and titles and then shuffled them around, without any bearing on labor, the exploitation of labor, and the growth of the social product. Bearing in mind Marx's warning to be wary of attributing too much significance to currencies, we should not, therefore, be afraid to look elsewhere than the ruble economy for the form taken by the money relation, especially in the Soviet producer goods sector. Indeed, such a step is directly implied by Dunayevskaya's astute distinction between apparent Soviet, quote, profit and the actual profit relation of the Soviet capital circuit. See Chapter 2 above. If in Western capitalism the credit system takes the form of a sphere of bargaining, of which certain characteristics are inevitably bureaucratic, and which corresponds to a form of money, credit, then in the Soviet context it makes sense to see Soviet economic bureaucracy as corresponding to a form of money too, namely bureaucratic clout, influence, permission, and blot. The Western-style overall domination by considerations of currency-denominated accumulation was absent, but the essential domination of capital underlying this was not, namely, by the cycle of accumulating value, taking the alternate forms of productive forces and the representation of control over such forces manifested in portions which were necessarily and generally bargainable. I'm going to repeat that because there was italics in the last bit. The Western-style overall domination by considerations of currency-denominated accumulation was absent, but the essential domination of capital underlying this was not, namely, by the cycle of accumulating value, taking the alternate forms of productive forces, and the representation of control over such forces manifested in portions which were necessarily and generally bargainable. Once we see that in large-scale circulation money itself took a form which was principally bureaucratic, we have solved the riddle. Footnote. In the theoretical presentation above, we have tried to anchor the argument as solidly as possible upon the fundamental concepts of private appropriation, exchange, wage labor, and surplus value. Chen Erjin, Erjin, takes a very different approach, ascribing major significance to concepts such as revisionism, historical necessity, and the division between the economic and the political, but nonetheless it is worth mentioning that one of his formulations in certain ways parallels our conclusions, considering the system of, quote, revisionism, which he sees as an actuality in the USSR and a possibility in China. He writes that, quote, such ownership, bracket, by the bureaucratic monopoly privileged class, end bracket, forms an immensely competitive system of capital accumulation. An immensely competitive system of capital accumulation, bracket, emphasis added, end bracket, ... It is an enhanced privilegized form of the private ownership system. For the bourgeoisie pools its capital for investment purposes and derives profits in proportion to the amount of capital individually invested. Exploitation is carried out through the capitalization of the means of production. But the bureaucrat monopoly privileged class bands together for political purposes and enriches itself through the sweat and toil of the people in proportion to the amount of power individually possessed. Exploitation is carried out through the, quote, privilegization of the concentration of power demanded by social production under public ownership, and through the subsequent capitalization of privilege, end quote. Even if Chen Erjin argues that, quote, revisionism, end quote, is a quite different, quote, mode of exploitation, end quote, from capitalism, this last concept of the capitalization of privilege would seem quite compatible with our own understanding of Soviet blot as a form of money. Unfortunately, though, Chen Erjin's work is characterized by great theoretical imprecision, assuming that it is sensible to refer to the existence of capital accumulation in the absence of capitalism. Erjin is clearly not in a position to develop his concept in any profound way. It might be said that he describes Soviet-type privilege as capital without paying attention to what capital actually is, self-expanding value. His concept of capitalization, a term he applies to both East and West, is seemingly full of promise, but remains dismally underdeveloped. But all the same, it must be noted that the concept of the capitalization of privilege is still much more advanced than the vague view given by Horvat that in terms of the, quote, Marxian analysis of alienation, end quote, the concepts of, quote, money, quote, buying, and, quote, ownership can be replaced in the context of the USSR with those of, quote, office, quote, doing, and, quote, incumbency, and the concept of, quote, commodity fetishism, end quote, with that of, quote, office fetishism, end quote. Unlike Horvat, Chen Erjin does relate bureaucratic privilege to social production. One second. End footnote. What in the West plays a certain role in mediating the rule of money capital in its currency form without being reducible to, quote, a quote, case, end quote, of its taking that form, was thus in the USSR the principal form that money capital actually took. The fact that power over the productive forces, pull, did not appear as different from its own representation, recognized pull, was merely an example of the false consciousness produced by the political economy. In the course of the actual cycle of the expanded reproduction of value, and more specifically the processes of bureaucratic bargaining and exchange, the specific forms of capitalist competition, the distinction and interplay between these two categories was crucial. We wish to make it clear that in presenting this understanding we are not suggesting that capitalist money in the USSR was largely, quote, non-quantitative, end quote. Since the nature of money capital is determined by its fulfillment of a role functional to the growth of capital, clearly it must permit the controllers of capital to recognize whether or not their capital has grown. It must also allow them to recognize by how much it has grown. Both considerations are quantitative, but the key point is that a generalized basis for such assessment need not necessarily involve the assignment of a number to each, quote, result of production, end quote, followed by the name of currency, a currency. What is crucial is the generalized basis of quantitative comparison, not the, quote, numericality, end quote, of such a basis. That is, not the assignment of numbers in exact ratios to each individual result and comparison. To answer the question, quote, how much profit, end quote, might be, quote, a lot, end quote, or, quote, not as much as last time, end quote, or, quote, enough to curry as much favor as I expected, end quote, or, quote, slightly less than my competitor got, end quote, or, quote, not quite enough to allow me to have a new plant built unless my competitor does much worse than before, end quote. By aiding the exploiters in the making of subjective investment decisions, the interconnectedness of such quantitative assessments, their shared, quote, language, end quote, serves its function for the exploitative class as a whole, for self-expanding value as subject. Under market conditions, the standardization of numerical, quote, language, end quote, makes the general and quantitative nature of the basis of assessment immediately apparent, whereas money in the form of blot/bureaucratic office can often leave its own generalized, quantitatively comparative nature somewhat more obscure. But in fact, the basis is general and quantitative in both cases, and in being so is functional to capital as subjectivity. There is, perhaps, one last ditch which the defenders of a, quote, non-capitalist, end quote, position might wish to defend against this theory. This is the argument that is, quote, a, quote, symbol presupposing general recognition, end quote. Soviet bureaucratic money was rather more, quote, fractured, end quote, than the pounds, dollars, and yen which are moved around with the world credit system, to such an extent that the, quote, generality, end quote, of recognition as an equivalent should be put into question. Hence, whereas in, say, the United States, $1 million might realistically be transformed from a current account to stocks in a South African gold mine, the portion of blot money held by Kazakh Republic's Minister of Industrial Construction was not exchangeable in any realistic sense for anything at all, even in the Moscow transport sector, let alone anything in South Africa. Of course, there are two objections here. The first relating to the exchangeability within the USSR, the second relating to the question of, quote, world money, end quote. Both, though, are in fact resolvable in quite simple terms. With reference to the first, we could cite Marx's statement in a seldom quoted footnote in Volume 1 of Capital that, quote, is by no means self-evident that the form of direct and universal exchangeability is an antagonistic form, as inseparable from its opposite, the form of non-direct exchangeability, as the positivity of one pole of a magnet is from the negativity of the other pole, end quote. As he continued, quote, this has allowed the illusion to arise that all commodities can simultaneously be imprinted with the stamp of direct exchangeability in the same way that it might be imagined that all Catholics can be popes, end quote. Marx, Capital. Marx then describes how the literal and direct exchangeability of each commodity for all the others is simply the, quote, Philistine utopia, end quote, of Proudhon. The context of these remarks is the connection between the role of a specific commodity as a, quote, direct and universal equivalent, end quote, and the non-direct exchangeability of all commodities in general, but we would reinterpret them to underline the fact that capitalism does not actually have to involve conditions wherein once commodity X has been exchanged for a sum of money Y, Y can then immediately be exchanged for any other commodity in the world. Only for those critics whose concept of capitalism has lost its moorings in the concrete could this appear to be so. In reality, not only is the money relation a mediation, but within the mediation there are more specific mediating relations which do not abolish the form and function of money as soon as they become bureaucratic. The Marxian critique of the capitalist commodity and capitalist money as forms of value rests on the understanding of the indirect but real and generalized socialization of alienated labor through generalized commodity exchange, not on the hypothetical possibility of literal exchangeability as merely a single and undifferentiated remove of any one thing for anything else. Footnote. Of course, there has never been such an contradictedly free market. To posit such a market as the essence of capitalism is to adopt a non-materialist attitude by disregarding the forms of appearance of actual exchangeability. Would James Goldsmith have been allowed to buy the Times? End footnote. Money as general equivalent is not simply a black hole into which a commodity's value can be injected in order later to be ejected, as if from a white hole into a material good elsewhere. Rather, as what is now fundamentally money capital, it has its own internal passageways, forms and rules which do not define its essence as a value form, but which nonetheless must exist, and which exist with different characteristics according to specific sets of historical circumstances. The second possible objection reduces to the isolation of the USSR from the world market, but this is hardly a substantial argument once the general critique of the internal conditions is accepted. One might well ask, if the capitalist world were divided into two separate halves, would they both stop being capitalist? To rely on this argument, one has first to assume that the development of capitalism in Western countries, ultimately Western European countries, was not only, quote, classical, but, quote, normal, and that whatever there was in the USSR was, quote, peculiar, and would only have been capitalist if it had been fully conjoined to developments west of Prague. This would be a very biased and anti-empirical way to reach a theoretical critique of the history of capitalism. It is not at all based on a consideration of the internal contradictions of the political economy prevalent in the USSR. In the final analysis, those who wish to maintain that the USSR was a non-capitalist formation will only be able to stress and stress again the fact that there was no individual ownership of enterprises, and that in important parts of the economy, ruble holdings did not possess the characteristics of money as a form of capital. Accepting both of these points as true, we are arguing that in the capitalist world, which extends across the entire globe, such quantities of currency are not the only form that money can take. Instead, they are a specific type of legally backed, quote, entitlement, end quote, a form of exchange value whose effective, quote, currency, end quote, depends on the specific organization of the groups of exploiters controlling a specific territory, and in particular on the type of organization of their internal competition. In the USSR, this currency, in any active sense, was nil in much of the economy, but the crucial point is that other forms of, quote, recognized pool, end quote, could and did fulfill the same function as quantities of currency in countries ruled by the bourgeoisie. Footnote. In considering the changes which capitalism experienced during the economic crises beginning in the First World War, we would thus emphasize the collapse of the ruble in 1917 to 18 and its eventual relatively viable replacement in large-scale capital circulation by a bureaucratic form at the end of the 1920s. And in the economic crisis evident throughout the 1990s, considered in relation to the changes which capitalism would have to undergo in order to escape the doldrums, we would stress above all the issue of convertibilization, the rapid, quote, external, end quote, convertibilization of rubles for dollars and other, quote, hard, end quote, currencies only points up the continued need on the part of Russian capital for a widespread, quote, internal, end quote, convertibilization of currency, whether rubles or dollars, for means of production and vice versa. We return to this point in Chapter 7. End footnote. New section. Soviet capitalism, its specificity. In formulating a theoretical critique of the USSR, we have attributed great weight to an understanding of the form taken by exchange relations among bureaucrats, and therefore we have not focused simply on, quote, state ownership, end quote, a purely legal form. Consequently, we would refrain from using the term, quote, state capitalism, end quote, to describe the nature of the system, usually employed in contradistinction to, quote, private capitalism, end quote. This term has the additional fault of concealing the fact that private appropriation always held full sway in the USSR, just as it had done elsewhere. On the other hand, though, since the economic system undoubtedly arose sui generis, it certainly remains necessary to have a ready term to describe the USSR in the context of the history of world capitalism. Footnote. Clearly, capitalism, a mode of production which became global, which is founded on wage labor and the money commodity money prime cycle, can utilize a number of different systems of competition and control, ranging from apartheid to the Republic of the Ayatollahs, from the British Old Boy Network to the Chinese triads, from the Ecuadorian military hierarchy to the German banking system, from Peronism to parliamentary committees. The precise characteristics of these systems depend upon the nature of past and present class and intra-class struggles, the role and importance of each area or power within world capitalist society, and factors inherited from pre-capitalist societies. End footnote. Footnote. On the, quote, Russian question, see the list of works mentioned in the introduction. End footnote. Whilst we have rejected Buick and Crump's theory of the, quote, state capitalist market, end quote, emphasizing instead the bureaucratic features of the Soviet system and the absence of any, quote, active, end quote, role for the ruble and much of the producer sector, it does not follow that bureaucracy is a major feature of Soviet-type systems alone and not of the countries ruled by the bourgeoisie. One theorist to point this out has been the, quote, self-managementist, end quote, Castoriadis, who uses the terms, quote, fragmented bureaucratic capitalism, end quote, total bureaucratic capitalism, end quote, to describe the bourgeois and Soviet-type systems respectively. His critique of bureaucracy, however, a form which he hypostatizes, becomes resolutely non-Marxist, since he holds the libertarian view that the fundamental contradiction of capitalism is that which exists between givers and takers of orders. Thus, Castoriadis arrives at a rather blunted critique of bourgeois political economy, which for the Marxist might be bureaucratic, but is not essentially so, in such a way that capital appears as a form which simply mediates bureaucratic rule. Indeed, that is not even the case in the USSR. Moreover, libertarian anti-bureaucratism can easily lead to the view that, since the USSR was, quote, totally bureaucratic, it must have represented a more, quote, advanced form of domination than that of the bourgeoisie, and consequently should have been seen as the, quote, main enemy, end quote. This is indeed the path along which Castoriadis has traveled in recent years. See a piece of his from 1981. Footnote. Castoriadis eventually comes to open an article with the following sentence, quote, clearly, bracket, sick, end bracket, stratocratic Russia's aim is the expansion of its empire and ultimately world domination, end quote. His position, which changed little even after Gorbachev came to power in 1985, has led Castoriadis to be viewed in some circles as a, quote, libertarian Cold Warrior, end quote. In view of his eventual, quote, Europeanism, end quote, one might query the direction of the logical link he makes between the position that the USSR is the most advanced superpower and the position that it is the, quote, main enemy, end quote. Since these terms are political economic rather than geographical, the future establishment of a currency as the principal form of Russian money capital, or indeed of a combination of currencies, the ruble, the dollar, and the Deutschmark or euro, say, would thus mean that the economy would then be one of bourgeois market capitalism. End footnote. Thus, it is not possible for us to adopt Castoriadis' terminology either. It would certainly be possible to refer to the system in which portions of blot money were exchanged, invested, and accumulated as being a kind of bureaucratic market. But then, of course, the market in Western economies is to a fair extent blot-mediated too, including at the top, without the role of the currency being reduced to that of the ruble in the USSR. The difference lies in the form of money, wishing for a terminology which neither overemphasizes nor denies the major differences between the bourgeois and Soviet systems, and hoping to encourage critique rather than to discourage it with flashy neologisms, we would therefore suggest using the terms, quote, bourgeois and, quote, market capitalist, end quote, to describe the economic systems where money capital takes the form of currency, and faute de mieux, quote, bureaucratic capitalist, end quote, to describe the USSR. According to Merriam-Webster, faute de mieux means for lack of something better or more desirable. New section. Back to the text, new section. Summary. In endeavoring to develop theoretically the, quote, capitalist, end quote, hypothesis, we have assumed throughout that the most logical basis on which to proceed is a consideration of fundamental categories of political economy. We have thus started by discussing the categories of the commodity, wage labor, and production for profit. We then give a, quote, nutshell, end quote, definition of capitalism as a mode of production founded upon exchange as a general form and growth as an underlying drive. Developing the analysis, we show how behind these realities lie the fundamental categories of value and abstract labor. Money is introduced as the general equivalent form of value. Once capital is shown to be a cycle of expanding value, taking the alternate forms of the capitalist commodity C and capitalist money M, the latter term is then defined in relation to the capitalist cycle as a functional necessity. We then argue that the first three categories continued to exist in the USSR, with perhaps the most controversial finding being the continued and generalized prevalence of exchange relations, and hence the commodity, in the producer goods sector. This is argued in the course of a lengthy analysis of the nature of the dominant relations of consumption, distribution, and production. After showing that the predominant form of exploitation of labor power was founded upon its purchase, we then suggest that the systemic nature of a drive for growth was similarly evident. Hence, the USSR was capitalist in nature. Once the categories of value and abstract labor are identified, the theoretical task becomes one of identifying Soviet, quote, money as money, end quote. This is approached by focusing above all on the function of the money form of capital, as the generalized means by which the controllers of the extraction of surplus value assess their returns and reinvest them. An argument is presented in which bureaucratic forms of permission, and more generally blot, are understood as fulfilling this function, and therefore as constituting a form of money capital other than the ruble. Special emphasis is laid throughout on the necessarily competitive nature of Soviet economic bureaucracy. Since the term, quote, state capitalism, end quote, is seen to refer not to competitiveness, but mainly to a legal form, it is rejected in favor of the term bureaucratic capitalism. This term is not, however, used to support a theory of, quote, modern bureaucracy, end quote, in general. Rather, this term, bureaucratic capitalism, is counterposed to the bourgeois capitalism or market capitalism, which holds sway in areas where the basic form of money capital is the currency. It is argued that the Soviet political economy is founded upon wage labor and upon bureaucratic forms of both exchange value and money, and hence given the systemic need for growth and accumulation of capital, on the accumulation of capital. In short, the USSR was a capitalist country which is especially bureaucratic, wherein money capital took forms which are largely bureaucratic rather than currency based. And that's the end of the chapter. Thank you so much for listening. The next chapter is titled The Class Struggle, a Critique of Sovietological Theories.